Some ancient societies developed customs so horrifying that entire communities lived in constant fear of punishment or sacrifice. Families saw loved ones dragged away to meet their fate in public squares or on temple platforms. Huge crowds gathered to watch these ordeals, and the sight of blood was not enough to make them turn away because, in many cases, they had no choice. Rulers demanded obedience, and the threat of torture or execution was always near. If anyone questioned the traditions or challenged authority, they risked facing the same grim fate as those who had already been taken. This created a cycle in which people felt trapped. They had to follow these frightening rules or risk ending up as part of the gruesome events they dreaded. Archaeological evidence shows that forms of human sacrifice, brutal executions, and psychological intimidation were not isolated to one culture. This pattern appeared in different regions, from Mesoamerica to the Mediterranean, from the Far East to the northern reaches of Europe. Beliefs in gods or spirits often drove these actions, but political control played an equally large role. By creating displays of terror, leaders ensured that everyone under their rule thought twice before breaking any law or showing disloyalty. Over time, these practices evolved into accepted norms, even when they caused deep emotional trauma to those forced to witness them or live under the threat of them. One unsettling example can be found in the accounts of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs built impressive cities, had advanced knowledge of agriculture, and maintained a far-reaching trade network. Yet they are also known for large-scale human sacrifices at temple sites. Spaniards who arrived in the early 16th century reported that the stairs of certain pyramids ran red with blood from rituals involving the removal of beating hearts. In many cases, the victims were prisoners of war. The purpose was to please powerful gods and ensure the sun continued its course, bringing harvests and order to the world. These acts also served as warnings to potential enemies. Some historians suggest the sheer scale of sacrifice underlined the Aztecs' might and helped them control conquered peoples. This system created constant fear, as entire populations knew they could become offerings if they were captured or if the ruling authorities decided to assert power. Another stark illustration can be seen among the Maya, whose civilization rose to great heights with pyramid building, advanced mathematics, and detailed calendars. Yet, their depictions of bloodletting rituals include scenes where rulers used obsidian blades to draw their own blood, which they offered to various gods. Royal figures sometimes pierced their tongues or genitals, then collected the blood on cloth or paper, which was later burned so that its smoke rose toward the heavens. Beyond these self-inflicted rites, captured warriors or high-status prisoners might also be sacrificed, with their hearts removed or their heads severed. Some of these events took place on platforms in full view of the surrounding population. The practice was thought to keep cosmic order intact, and refusal to take part was not an option. Those who feared such events could hardly speak out, since any sign of dissent might lead to accusations of disrespect toward the gods. In other regions, terror emerged in different ways. The civilization of Carthage, situated in North Africa, left behind a deeply troubling archaeological record. Excavations have uncovered small urns containing the bones of children, suggesting that child sacrifice may have been part of a religious tradition. Ancient writers accused Carthaginians of placing infants onto a heated bronze statue dedicated to their god, though modern scholars debate the frequency of this event. Regardless of the exact scale, the evidence points to a practice in which parents sometimes sacrificed their own offspring to gain favor in war or to secure better fortunes. Outsiders, including the Romans who later fought against Carthage, spread stories of these sacrifices to justify their campaigns. However, it is clear that local customs did allow for the killing of children in a religious context, an idea that shakes the modern mind. Farther east, ancient China developed strict laws and punishments that could shock even the hardest hearts. Imperial power often hinged on public demonstrations of authority. Methods like Ling Chi, known as the death by 1,000 cuts, were used to punish crimes considered especially severe. The condemned person would be bound, and small pieces of flesh were methodically sliced off over an extended period, prolonging agony. This display was meant to warn others against disobeying the emperor or committing treason. Family members of a convicted criminal could also face exile, forced labor, or death under the principle of collective responsibility. To maintain their hold, rulers used these severe punishments to generate fear and submission throughout the empire, which at times covered a vast territory with millions of inhabitants. Ordinary people lived under the weight of these laws, knowing that the slightest misstep could lead to an excruciating end or severe consequences for relatives. In the Roman world, discipline was paramount, and the penalties for insubordination were extreme. One feared practice was decimation, used to punish military units found guilty of cowardice or mutiny. Soldiers cast lots, and 1 in every 10 was selected for execution by the remaining members of the group. The method of killing could involve stoning or beating, ensuring that the survivors played a direct role in delivering the punishment. This ruthless system maintained control, reminding every soldier that a lack of loyalty could bring death not only for them but for the men they fought alongside. Roman society at large also witnessed regular displays of lethal force. Public executions and the gruesome spectacles of gladiatorial contests took place in large arenas. The crowds cheered as warriors fought to the death or as criminals and prisoners were torn apart by wild animals. This normalized violence within the culture, blurring the line between entertainment and state-sanctioned brutality. Ancient Sparta is often recalled for its military prowess and discipline. However, the way Spartan society treated newborns stands out as exceptionally harsh. Soon after birth, infants were examined by elders. If they showed signs of weakness or deformity, they might be abandoned in the wilderness to perish. This system aimed to raise only the fittest children, who would become formidable warriors or strong mothers of future soldiers. Even those who survived faced a childhood of constant training, where they were taught to endure hunger and pain without complaint. Ritual floggings and punishing physical regimens were part of daily life. By adulthood, Spartans were known for their courage in battle, but the cost in terms of human suffering was immense. Some mothers might never see their sons again after they were sent to the agoge, the rigorous education and training program. The memory of these practices remains a testament to how deeply a society might sacrifice compassion to create disciplined warriors. Beyond these well-documented cultures, other unsettling traditions can be found in less extensively recorded societies. Some Celtic groups displayed the heads of enemies on stakes or brought them home as trophies after battle. This act was connected to spiritual beliefs in the power of the human head. Warriors sometimes kept the skulls of respected adversaries in specially crafted chests or jars filled with oils to preserve them. These heads were considered prized possessions, reflecting honor earned in battle. Shrines or sacred sites with multiple skulls discovered by archaeologists suggest that this was not a rare practice. Modern observers might see such behavior as inhuman, yet for those warriors, it was part of their code. They believed that victory and valor were affirmed by bringing back the heads of opponents, which became potent symbols of status and spiritual might. In the domain of punishments and executions, the ancient world featured many devices designed to cause prolonged suffering. The brazen bull, mentioned in accounts related to ancient Sicily, was one such invention. Allegedly, a hollow bronze figure shaped like a bull was heated from below by a fire. Victims placed inside were burned alive, with their screams echoing through pipes that distorted the sound into eerie bellows. Legends say the creator of this device even tested it on an unsuspecting victim. While historians continue to debate the frequency of its use, the idea alone shows the lengths some leaders went to in order to intimidate rivals or punish crimes. The brazen bull became an icon of cruelty, and stories of it spread well beyond Sicily, symbolizing the worst forms of punishment that tyrants could inflict. Certain methods were designed not just to kill but to shatter the spirit of the condemned. In ancient Persia, there are reports of a punishment called scaphism. The victim was trapped between two boats or in a hollowed-out log, forced to ingest large amounts of milk and honey, then left to the mercy of insects and the natural elements. Bound and unable to move, the person would be attacked by swarms of flies, bees, and other creatures. Over time, infection, exposure, and relentless torment led to a drawn-out, agonizing death. The account of scaphism comes from Greek sources describing Persian customs, and while some historians argue about the accuracy or frequency, the mere existence of such a story underscores how horrifying ancient punishments could be. The intended effect was not merely death, but a spectacle that would remain in the memories of any who heard about it. Across early civilizations, fear also played a role in spiritual rites. In many communities, it was believed that offering human lives or the lives of animals was essential to maintaining cosmic balance. If crops were failing or a drought threatened the population, individuals might be selected by priests or local leaders to be killed as an appeasement to the gods. Such traditions could involve elaborate ceremonies, but they inevitably ended with blood spilled in the name of divine favor. The fear of natural disasters or enemy invasions merged with the fear of religious duty, making it difficult for ordinary citizens to question these events. They lived under a system in which speaking out could be interpreted as resisting divine will, bringing punishment not only upon themselves but upon their families and neighbors. In some parts of the ancient world, entire families could be punished for the offenses of one member. Collective responsibility meant that if a person broke a law considered dangerous to the ruling class, even innocent relatives might suffer exile, enslavement, or worse. Such a policy ensured loyalty, because people not only feared for their own lives, but also for the lives of their parents, spouses, and children. This led to a climate of suspicion. Neighbors might report one another to authorities to avoid being implicated in someone else's supposed crimes. The constant sense of menace undermined trust within communities, but it kept those in power safe from rebellions. The knowledge that any misstep could lead to dire consequences shaped social relations and everyday behavior. While many ancient societies left remarkable legacies, architecture, art, laws, literature, the horrifying aspects of their customs reveal a darker dimension of human history. Monuments such as pyramids, temples, and tombs were sometimes constructed with slave labor, with workers subjected to lethal conditions. The process of building certain wonders could cost the lives of thousands, whose names were never recorded. Their suffering remained hidden behind the grandeur celebrated by kings, pharaohs, and other leaders. Some traditions praise the cruelty as a necessary measure for maintaining order. Religious leaders, oracles, or prophets might have explained that these harsh actions were demanded by higher powers or fate. Those who refused to believe it still found themselves in no position to argue. Fear of curses also played a part in discouraging theft or grave robbery. In ancient Egypt, certain tomb inscriptions warned that the intruder would face haunting forces or deadly illnesses if they violated the final resting place of a noble or pharaoh. While modern science dismisses these curses as superstition or psychological suggestion, the power of belief at the time was strong. The knowledge of violent repercussions, whether in this life or beyond, could keep tombs sealed for centuries. Yet, tomb robberies still happened when desperate individuals or cunning criminals tried to steal gold or valuable artifacts. If caught, the punishment was merciless, frequently involving torture or execution. This further cemented the idea that the living had to respect the domain of the dead or face dire penalties. In the realm of warfare, ancient battles were often fought with minimal rules of engagement. Victors frequently massacred or enslaved entire populations. The idea of sparing the weak or preserving cities for humanitarian reasons was not widespread. Instead, sacking a city could lead to a bloodbath, with survivors sold in slave markets. Armies that advanced across territories built reputations for ruthless acts, hoping to scare defenders into surrender before a fight began. The fear of these unstoppable forces traveling from one region to another created a chain reaction. Cities might open their gates to the enemy without a single arrow fired, simply to avoid the terrifying outcome of a siege. Once inside, the conquerors could still turn violent if they wished to make an example of the inhabitants. Across time, these patterns showed that the threat of violence was a key tool for rulers. Grand religious ceremonies, strict legal codes, and terrifying execution methods were part of daily life. While some individuals in positions of power saw these actions as essential for maintaining cosmic or social balance, many ordinary people likely felt trapped by traditions they could not change. Children grew up hearing stories of brutal sacrifices and witnessed public punishments that left deep psychological scars. The knowledge that disobedience could result in unspeakable agony stifled opposition. Even those who secretly questioned the morality of such practices had to weigh the risks. It was safer to remain silent than to become the next victim in a world where suffering and death were used as instruments of control. Modern observers sometimes overlook these realities when admiring the ruins and relics of ancient civilizations. We see the remains of monumental architecture and refined art, but the darker social mechanisms behind them remain harder to grasp. Excavations at sacrificial altars, mass graves, and cursed tombs remind us that life in many of these cultures was full of dread. People did not always have the freedom to live peacefully or celebrate their achievements without the looming possibility of violence. The evidence appears in bones bearing marks of violent deaths, in written records of punishments, and in the design of spaces built specifically for public spectacles. These details may not always be highlighted in popular accounts of the past, but they offer a deeper understanding of how ancient rulers wielded terror as a tool. Some of these horrifying methods were abolished or replaced over the centuries, but in many regions, fear remained part of governance. Time brought changes in leadership and belief systems, yet the cycle of cruelty persisted in various forms. When one empire fell, another might rise and adopt similar strategies to maintain order. Fear is a potent force that can stop rebellions, but it also leaves a mark on the culture it afflicts. The stories of mass executions, forced sacrifices, and dreadful punishments spread through oral tradition and written texts. Over the generations, they became warnings about human potential for cruelty. Yet they also served as lessons about authority, religion, and the dangers of unchecked power. In some cases, historians debate the accuracy or scope of certain accounts. Ancient writers often exaggerated the cruelty of their enemies to justify conquest or to boost the image of their own leaders. However, archaeological findings and cross-referenced records show that at least portions of these tales are grounded in fact. Scattered remains at sacrificial temples, evidence of battered skeletons on battlefields, and carved inscriptions describing punishments all align to confirm that these practices were not mere myths. Communities that performed them passed down their reasoning through myths and theology, explaining that such actions were required to sustain cosmic order or to prove loyalty to powerful rulers or gods. For modern readers, these ancient realities can be overwhelming. Yet they remain crucial to understanding the full scope of human history. They offer a stark contrast to the ideals of human rights and personal freedom that many strive for today. Reflecting on these grim customs helps highlight the progress that has been made, while also reminding us that the seeds of cruelty can still appear under different conditions. Some might view these stories as relics of a barbaric past, but others see them as cautionary tales about the cruelty that can emerge when authority is not checked. They underscore how an entire society can be guided, or intimidated, into normalizing what later generations see as unspeakable. While it is easy to focus on famous monuments and achievements, the stories of those who suffered are just as important. The public squares and temple courtyards where sacrifices took place are now silent ruins, but they once echoed with screams. The remains of infants in Carthage, the mass graves of war captives in Mesoamerica, and the hidden tombs in Egypt speak of hopes betrayed by brutal traditions. Some children were never given the chance to grow up, and countless men and women died in the name of laws or gods they barely understood. Their stories, pieced together from fragments, reveal the harsh truth that the foundations of many ancient societies were soaked in blood. This part serves as a window into that daunting world. It shows how entire populations were governed by fear and how rulers relied on terror to hold power. The memory of these events comes to us through archaeological sites, ancient texts, and legend. They tell of a time when cruelty was so woven into daily life that few dared to challenge it. Many ordinary people felt they had no way out, no option to protest. As a result, customs we now call horrifying became part of the social fabric, repeated for generations until new forces, be they conquerors or cultural shifts, finally brought them to an end or transformed them into less lethal forms. Yet the echoes of these practices have not faded entirely. They remain as stories, artifacts, and stark reminders that across the span of centuries, the line between order and terror can become dangerously thin. Archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of a world where fear shaped customs and beliefs. Around the Mediterranean, across the Americas, and through the lands of Asia and Africa, ancient societies sometimes used terror to unite people under a single creed or leader. We have carved steles, manuscripts on papyrus or bark, and stone inscriptions that record acts most would call unspeakable. These records highlight the power of rites that demanded bloodshed, the passing of harsh sentences for petty crimes, and the extreme control exercised by nobility and priesthoods. Entire economies depended on forced labor. Whole cities were built on the backs of those who had no freedom. Meanwhile, cruel punishments or sacrifices reminded everyone of the consequences of disobedience. Much of this was justified as divine will. In many cultures, a person's worth was tied to pleasing the spirits or gods who oversaw the cycle of life. By taking part in what most modernists see as brutal actions, people believed they kept cosmic or natural order intact. This belief helped rulers retain authority. If a leader, king, or high priest declared that the gods demanded a certain number of human offerings, few dared to question it. Traditional lore taught that rejecting these demands brought drought, famine, plague, or defeat in battle. Families lived under the weight of these dire warnings, fearing that they might be chosen as the next sacrifices if they seemed unwilling to comply. One example appears in the traditions of the Inca, who rose to power high in the Andes. Their empire stretched across a vast region of South America, linked by roads and bridges through steep mountain passes. Known for terraced agriculture and impressive stonework, they also performed child sacrifices, sometimes at mountaintop shrines. During important events, such as the death of an emperor or a severe climate crisis, certain youths were selected to be ritually killed. These children traveled with priests up dangerous mountain paths, where icy winds cut through thin air. After ceremonial rites involving offerings of corn beer, coca leaves, and precious garments, the children were left to the elements or slain. Their perfectly preserved remains have been found by modern climbers, providing a chilling insight into how far a society might go to honor its rulers or gods. The parents of these children may have believed the sacrifice was a sacred duty, but the grief must have been overwhelming. In the same part of the world, older civilizations performed comparable acts. The Moche culture, which thrived along coastal valleys in what is now Peru, left behind pottery scenes of sacrifices tied to seasonal or ritual cycles. Warrior priests, adorned with fine regalia, presided over ceremonies that included blood offerings. Prisoners of war, stripped of their clothing and rank, faced execution in front of crowds. Scenes painted on ceramic vessels show lines of captives, sometimes battered or bleeding, led to an elevated platform where a priest or priestess cut their throats. The resulting blood was collected in cups or goblets, then ritually consumed or presented to the gods. This practice was seen as crucial for agricultural fertility and to maintain power. Excavated tombs with elite remains hint at a hierarchy that thrived on terror. Those at the top commanded both awe and dread, ensuring obedience through the threat of being the next victim. In regions of ancient North America, evidence suggests that certain tribes also performed ritual killings, though the scale varied. The Cahokia settlement near the Mississippi River, known for its large mounds, includes burial sites that hint at mass sacrifice. One pit reveals the remains of young women laid in layers, some apparently strangled or struck on the head before burial. Nearby, skeletons of men show signs of violent execution. These incidents might have been connected to ceremonies honoring leadership transitions or cosmic events. While the exact motives remain uncertain, the bodies indicate that death was not limited to warfare. A segment of the population was set apart for these grim endings, reinforcing the power structures that controlled community life. People living near these centers might have viewed the sight of newly dug pits and heard rumors of what happened to those chosen for the rites. That fear contributed to social cohesion, but at a terrible cost. Moving back to the Mediterranean region, we find that the Greeks and Romans both recorded disturbing acts among their neighbors. Greek historians wrote about a group called the Taurians, who reportedly sacrificed shipwrecked strangers to a local goddess. Though the practice is mentioned primarily in myths and may have been exaggerated, it shows how the idea of ritual violence was common enough to be discussed as a real possibility. Tales like these spread through travelers and traders, fueling stereotypes about distant lands where foreigners were offered to strange deities. Whether the Taurians truly killed visitors or not, the story itself reveals how people in the ancient world believed such things could happen. Fear of the unknown, mixed with actual accounts of brutal customs, gave rise to legends that fed ongoing suspicion between cultures. Among the Romans, crucifixion was widely used as a punishment for rebels, slaves who revolted, and those convicted of serious crimes. The condemned were forced to carry their crossbeams to the site of execution, where they were nailed or tied to the wood and left to die slowly from exhaustion, shock, and exposure. This method served both as a public deterrent and a shaming ritual, since the victims' bodies were displayed along busy roads or city entrances. Relatives and passers-by witnessed agonizing deaths, which sometimes lasted for days. After the famous Spartacus-led slave uprising, thousands of captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, forming a line of tortured bodies stretching for miles. Roman authorities considered this necessary for restoring order and warning anyone else who might consider revolt. Meanwhile, citizens who saw these grim sights experienced a blend of relief that they were not the ones on the cross and dread that such a fate could befall them if they crossed the line. Public punishments were not unique to Rome, of course. The ancient Assyrians, who ruled a powerful empire in Mesopotamia, made a point of depicting their victories on palace walls, including scenes of impaled prisoners. Assyrian kings boasted about the cities they destroyed and the captives they put to death in horrific ways. Detailed inscriptions describe skinning enemies alive or cutting off body parts as a warning to others. Massive stone reliefs from places like Nineveh and Nimrud show lines of soldiers carrying out these orders, with bodies displayed as examples. The images emphasize how the king's might and the empire's success were tied to punishing those who resisted. Nearby populations learned quickly that if they did not submit, they could suffer unimaginable torment. Over time, this ensured tribute payments and prevented unrest in many regions under Assyrian control. Egypt, known for achievements in architecture and art, also had its share of harsh methods. Workers building the massive pyramids or digging canals for irrigation were sometimes pressed into labor. Some think these laborers were not always slaves, but when the state required a project, men had little say in the matter. They worked under overseers who could apply severe discipline. Floggings were common, and food rations could be withheld to force compliance. For certain crimes, Egyptian authorities resorted to punishments like cutting off the nose or ears, banishing offenders to remote quarries, or even feeding them to wild beasts in the darkest periods of its history. While these practices might not have been as frequent as in some other regions, the official legal texts mention them. Royal decrees could also condemn entire groups if they posed a threat to the ruling dynasty, leaving families scattered or destroyed. It was a world where the pharaoh's word was absolute law. In parts of the ancient Near East, the concept of sacrificial substitution existed. If a priest interpreted signs that the king was destined to die, they might choose a substitute, a condemned man or sometimes a lesser noble, to stand in for the monarch. This individual took on the king's identity for a brief period, going through symbolic rituals before being killed in place of the real ruler. The idea was that the evil fate would attach to the substitute, sparing the rightful leader. Some records hint that after the sacrifice, the true king would resume his throne. This bizarre custom highlights how superstition could override basic empathy. The person forced into this role had no say, yet the court treated them as a necessary offering. Texts describing this process do not dwell on the suffering of the substitute. Instead, they focus on the relief that the impending disaster was diverted from the royal line. Human sacrifice sometimes took subtler forms. In a few traditions, it involved burying servants or prisoners alongside important figures. When a chieftain or ruler died, his retainers might be killed to accompany him into the afterlife. Tombs in various parts of the world show multiple skeletons arranged around the central burial chamber, sometimes with valuable objects or weapons. This was recorded in early dynastic China, in the tombs of pharaohs in Egypt's earliest periods, and amongst certain nomadic groups in the Eurasian steppes. The notion behind this practice was that the deceased needed attendants, guards, or concubines even after death. The exact method of killing those chosen remains unclear in many cases, but the fact they were buried at the same time as their master indicates that they did not die of natural causes. This act extended the control the elite had over others beyond the boundaries of life. Other societies practiced a mix of cannibalism and ritual killing, though the motivations varied. Some groups in the Pacific Islands, including certain tribes in what is now Papua New Guinea, had traditions of eating parts of an enemy to gain their strength or courage. This was not mere survival cannibalism but tied to spiritual beliefs. Warriors who consumed the flesh of a worthy adversary might believe they absorbed that person's power. Early accounts from European explorers who encountered these tribes are often tainted by sensationalism, but archaeological and oral histories confirm that certain rituals involving the consumption of body parts occurred. This practice inspired intense fear among neighboring groups, who worried not only about being killed, but also about being consumed in a final act of domination. In some cases, ceremonial cannibalism included the bodies of deceased relatives, though that was tied to ancestral reverence rather than hostility. Either way, the fact remains that human remains were sometimes part of religious and cultural observances, reflecting a worldview where the boundaries between life, death, and the supernatural were intertwined in disturbing ways. Torture devices from the ancient world also reveal how pain was inflicted on a systematic level. The rack, though more commonly mentioned in medieval times, has earlier origins. Evidence suggests that stretching devices might have existed in Greece or Persia, used to extract information or confessions. Another method involved the use of heated metal instruments to brand or mutilate a prisoner. In some courts, the concept of trial by ordeal required the accused to undergo painful tests, like grasping a red-hot iron, to prove innocence. If the wound healed cleanly, the gods were said to have confirmed the person's honesty. If it festered, guilt was presumed. These ordeals placed a person's fate in the hands of religious interpretations rather than factual inquiries. Naturally, many individuals found themselves at the mercy of biased judges who invoked divine will to justify a punishment. Public floggings, beatings, and forced marches across dangerous terrain also left scars that lingered in local memory. People learned that stepping out of line might lead to humiliating and painful ordeals with no chance of appeal. Beyond punishments, some medical procedures of the ancient world can seem horrifying by modern standards. Trephination, the practice of drilling holes into the skull, appears in various ancient cultures. Skulls with deliberate openings have been found in Europe, the Americas, and parts of Africa. While this could have been an early form of surgery to relieve pressure from head injuries, it sometimes carried a ritual element. A person's head might be open to let out evil spirits causing sickness. If the patient survived, the bone growth around the opening suggests that the wound healed over time. Although not necessarily intended as a punitive measure, the thought of undergoing such a process without modern anesthetics is unsettling. For some, it was a last resort, and the accompanying risk of infection or complications was enormous. Yet the fact that many skulls show signs of healing reveals that at least a portion of these procedures were successful, lending another layer of complexity to how ancient societies navigated pain and fear. In many parts of the world, religious rites involve deep trances or states of altered consciousness. Shamans, oracles, and priests sometimes took hallucinogenic substances or subjected themselves to harsh physical trials to commune with the divine. Onlookers might see them dance wildly, speak in unknown tongues, or wound themselves with blades. One function of these performances was to generate awe and fear, persuading the community that these spiritual leaders had genuine power. Some groups held rituals that included self-flagellation or the use of hooks inserted into skin to hang individuals from high places. Such scenes might horrify a casual observer, but for participants, they were a mark of devotion. Bloodshed could be seen as a means of purification or a way to tap into hidden forces that guided the universe. By demonstrating a willingness to endure agony, these holy figures showed that they were not ordinary humans, commanding respect and sometimes dread. The idea of magic or curses also held sway in many corners of the ancient world. People believed that witches, sorcerers, or malicious priests could harness supernatural powers to harm enemies or coerce them into submission. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia detail incantations used to ward off demons or hex arrival. Greek magical papyri include spells for love potions, revenge curses, and summoning spirits. These curses were sometimes placed in graves or wells, with the names of targets scratched onto lead tablets. The fear of hidden forces was strong, and accusations of witchcraft or evil magic could lead to mob violence or official punishment. In some legal codes, practicing harmful magic was punishable by death, because it threatened the order of society. People would take elaborate precautions, wearing amulets, burning certain herbs, or offering animal sacrifices to placate unseen dangers. This widespread fear of invisible threats added another layer of anxiety to daily life, as any argument or misfortune could be blamed on supernatural malice. The afterlife loomed large in most ancient belief systems, and fear of what followed death shaped a range of customs. In some places, people believed that a restless soul could return to torment the living. Detailed funeral rites aimed to ensure that the deceased found peace and would not wander as a hungry ghost or vengeful spirit. Objects were buried with the dead to provide comfort in the next realm. However, when someone died violently, there was a concern that their spirit might seek revenge. This led to actions like placing heavy stones on graves, decapitating corpses to prevent them from rising, or even driving stakes through the chest. Archaeologists working in Eastern Europe have uncovered graves with iron spikes hammered into skeletons, reflecting beliefs in vampirism or restless undead. The ancient horror of having the dead return to wreak havoc was not limited to folklore but reflected genuine fears that shaped how people disposed of bodies. It shows another dimension of anxiety, linked to the unknown territories beyond mortal life. Among warrior societies, ritualizing horror was a way of glorifying combat. Certain Germanic and Celtic tribes, for instance, held festivals honoring fallen fighters. The heads of enemies might be displayed on walls or carried on spears in parades. Drums and horns accompanied these displays, creating a dramatic spectacle that combined triumph with terror. For those who had lost loved ones in battles against these tribes, the spectacle also served as a cruel reminder of their defeat. The victorious warriors strengthened group identity by emphasizing the fate of those who opposed them. The knowledge that one's head could end up on a spike might lead to fear-based submission or dissuade neighboring clans from attacking in the first place. This tactic was not unique to Europe. Various cultures worldwide used body parts of enemies or captives as warnings. The messages, though brutal, were simple: resist, and you will face a dreadful end. In Mesoamerica, the ballgames held by societies like the Maya and the Aztecs sometimes ended with the sacrifice of players, although historians continue to debate the frequency and specifics. Court walls are decorated with imagery of decapitated figures and glyphs associated with ritual events. There's evidence that certain high-stakes games were linked to mythological stories about life, death, and rebirth. The possibility that participants might be sacrificed suggests a culture where sports merged with lethal religious practices. Spectators watching from the stands would see not only athletic skill but also the potential for bloodshed, which elevated the entire event to a sacred status. This, again, served as a warning and a demonstration of devotion. Society was reminded that even acts of entertainment could cross over into the domain of deadly ritual. One must also acknowledge that in many ancient cultures, ordinary days proceeded without direct violence for most people. Farmers tilled fields, craftspeople sold their goods, and families raised children. Yet lurking in the background was the awareness that if one angered the gods, offended a royal official, or ran afoul of local superstitions, swift and severe retribution could follow. This tension likely influenced how people communicated. They might avoid certain words or topics, fearing accusations of sacrilege or disrespect. Social hierarchies were heavily guarded by laws, mores, and traditions enforced through fear. Outsiders who arrived in a foreign land might become targets if they violated local taboos without knowing it. Captured travelers could face the same punishments and rituals as local criminals or sacrificial victims, with no defense available. Such tales spread across trade routes, carried by merchants and sailors who witnessed or heard second-hand accounts of these events. Over time, these stories reached distant lands, sometimes growing more sensational. Yet many had a core of truth. From the vantage point of modern society, it might be hard to imagine living under these conditions. However, for those born into these worlds, it was part of the natural order. Resistance was rare and dangerous. Leaders and priests benefited from a climate where questioning authority seemed unthinkable. Traditions that appear cruel to outsiders persisted for centuries, upheld by superstition, deep-seated beliefs, and the raw power wielded by those at the top. There were exceptions, of course. Some cultures allowed for forms of protest, negotiation, or appeals to higher authorities. Others had internal reforms that curbed the excesses of sacrifice or torture. Occasionally, new ideas about compassion, law, or spiritual mercy took hold, changing how communities treated captives and criminals. Still, these transformations were slow by modern standards. In many places, older patterns of brutality were replaced only when another empire arrived and imposed its own systems. Unfortunately, the conquering forces often brought their own forms of terror, creating a cycle in which fear simply took on a different shape. Certain philosophies and religious movements did challenge the reliance on terror. In ancient India, for instance, some kings influenced by Buddhist principles promoted nonviolence and welfare programs for their subjects. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka is one famous example. After witnessing the bloodshed of war, he embraced ideas of kindness and moral duty, proclaiming edicts that discouraged pointless killing. Yet these reforms did not always erase deeply rooted local traditions, and even Ashoka's domain had criminal penalties that could be harsh by modern standards. Human practices do not shift overnight. Generations might pass before a population fully adopts less violent methods, and even then, the threat of brutal enforcement might return if political winds changed. Primary sources from many ancient civilizations describe these dark customs in stark, matter-of-fact terms. The scribes writing them down might not have seen anything unusual about describing mass slaughters or ritual murders. They did not conceive of human rights as understood today. Instead, they often framed such deeds as necessary for stability, prosperity, or cosmic balance. These references to terror were recorded alongside mundane details about harvests, trade, and royal births, suggesting that violence was part of the social fabric. Modern readers might see a contradiction in building majestic monuments to honor life and beauty while carrying out atrocities nearby, but ancient mindsets could hold these ideas together without tension. Over centuries, memory softens certain details. Legends can turn cruel historical figures into misunderstood heroes, or they can exaggerate lesser acts of violence into monstrous episodes. Yet archaeological excavations increasingly confirm that many practices were quite real. The bones of sacrificial victims do not lie. The remains of torture instruments, the damage on skeletons, and the marks left in abandoned fortresses all speak of a time when cruelty was woven into everyday governance. By piecing together these clues, historians and anthropologists reveal a hidden side of antiquity that once lay beneath layers of myth and reverence for long-dead kings. The truth, as it emerges, is more unsettling than many of the legends themselves. Modern society often romanticizes certain ancient cultures, focusing on their art, philosophy, or architectural achievements. That admiration is not misplaced, but it often omits the less pleasant realities. The same empire that built a legendary wonder might have supported it through forced labor and violent expansion. A revered philosopher might have lived in a city that punished dissidents by cutting out their tongues. Recognizing these darker aspects does not erase the good that emerged from the ancient world, but it offers a fuller perspective. It reminds us that human beings, regardless of era, are capable of both great creativity and horrific deeds. It might be comforting to think that these horrors are safely in the past, but human history shows that violent control still appears in later periods. The ancient roots of fear-based rule set patterns that re-emerge under dictatorships and extremist regimes even in modern times. The difference today might be technology and global scrutiny, yet the core dynamic remains similar. A small group or a single ruler uses terror to maintain authority, while many people comply out of fear. Reflecting on ancient examples can remind us of the fragility of progress and the need to guard against slipping back into oppressive systems. Learning about these old customs also underscores how cultural beliefs can normalize practices that later generations see as shocking. Surviving written records, whether on clay, stone, metal, or organic materials, still speak across the ages. They detail laws that demanded limbs as punishment for minor offenses, priests who claimed the gods hungered for human flesh, and kings who built entire legacies on conquest and terror. In some sense, these documents challenge us to question how future societies will view our own era. They might find certain current customs just as appalling, even if we consider them normal. This perspective can foster a degree of humility when judging our ancestors. It shows that what seems unthinkable now was once woven into public life. And what we consider acceptable might horrify people centuries from now. The line between normal and monstrous can shift depending on cultural context, economic pressures, and religious doctrines. Ancient societies remind us that traditions, once set, can endure for countless generations, even if they involve extreme violence. Rituals that began with a small group might expand as a culture grows, eventually shaping political and legal systems. People who participated in these practices could rationalize them through religious texts, historical precedents, or social necessity. Some refused to question what their ancestors had done for centuries. Others may have doubted in silence, fearing retribution. In the end, these systems often collapsed or changed only when external forces disrupted them or when a profound ideological shift occurred. Examining these grim histories can be emotionally draining. We imagine the victims, the terrified onlookers, or the helpless parents forced to surrender a child for ritual ends. Their pain echoes through time, though we can never know the exact depths of their despair. We can only rely on skeletal remains, coded inscriptions, and the partial accounts of scribes who might have served the very rulers who ordered the killing. Some scribes wrote under pressure, aware that any criticism could result in their own demise. Thus, the lens through which we view these events is clouded by propaganda or selective silence. Yet enough consistent evidence remains to confirm that terror was not an outlier but a consistent thread in the cloth of many ancient civilizations. A question emerges: how did ordinary people cope with this environment? They might have found ways to live day by day, focusing on family, agriculture, or crafts, hoping never to draw the attention of those in power. Possibly, some placed deep trust in the religious justifications, finding comfort in the belief that the gods demanded these acts to ensure stability. Others, who saw the cruelty for what it was, had to weigh moral objections against the danger of speaking out. For the enslaved or conquered, daily life was a struggle to survive the demands of harsh masters or the possibility of being selected for sacrifice. In such settings, hope might come from minor acts of kindness, from a belief in a better afterlife, or from the distant dream of liberation. Yet many lived and died without seeing any major change, their stories lost except for a few fragments and silent bones. We continue to trace those fragments today. In remote areas, new archaeological sites come to light each year, sometimes revealing mass graves or unusual burial rituals that confirm old rumors about violent pasts. Scholars compare texts from different cultures to piece together patterns of conquest, oppression, and ritual killing. This work can correct misconceptions or highlight lesser-known examples of brutality. Through these studies, we form a more complete picture of how widespread terror tactics were in ancient governance. It becomes clear that, for all their differences, many societies converged on the same harsh methods when they sought absolute power. The trappings, different gods, different languages, different social structures, did not prevent them from resorting to similar extremes when it came to controlling people. Such patterns may strike a chord of recognition, as they mirror aspects of more recent eras. Rulers across time have discovered that orchestrating fear is one of the most efficient ways to ensure obedience. In ancient city-states, this was often accompanied by grand religious claims, binding supernatural duty to political might. Citizens who believed their very souls depended on compliance found it even harder to rebel. This confluence of religious fervor and authoritative command formed a potent combination, one that appears in various guises throughout history. It allowed small elites to maintain order over large populations. Where direct violence was not enough, the threat of curses, evil omens, or cosmic wrath filled any gaps in the chain of control. Yet, in some corners of the ancient world, individuals did push against the boundaries. There are isolated stories of people aiding fugitives, misleading authorities, or fleeing to less governed regions. These acts of resistance rarely find their way into official records but survive in legends or hidden notes. They show that not everyone bowed willingly. However, the system was often too large to overcome, and full revolts were uncommon without strong leadership and enough armed support. Those who rose up and failed faced horrors worse than the standard punishments. The bodies of rebels might be left on display for months, and their families faced collective penalties. In the face of such consequences, quiet endurance was the path most chose. Thousands of years ago, countless communities followed grim customs that might seem impossible to understand now. Archaeologists studying early human settlements continue to find remains indicating that violence, sacrifice, and public torture were woven into daily routines. While some documents and artifacts shed light on the motives behind these harsh methods, many details remain unclear. Still, each new dig site or translated inscription reveals more evidence that such acts were far from rare. In many cases, they were central to maintaining social and political order. Ordinary people had to obey or risk becoming part of the horrifying rites that terrified everyone around them. Consider the ancient world of the Indus Valley, where cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa thrived around 4,500 years ago. Their urban planning was advanced, with drainage systems, public baths, and standardized weights for trade. Yet scattered remains and mysterious symbols hint that all might not have been peaceful. While direct evidence of large-scale human sacrifice has not been found there, some skeletons display unusual injuries. Bodies appear in positions suggesting they died unexpectedly, possibly during raids or in episodes of localized violence. Researchers debate whether these findings point to internal conflicts or external invasions. Whatever the cause, the scattered bones remind us that even in sophisticated city cultures, safety was fragile. A sudden upheaval could leave victims piled in alleyways, with no records explaining exactly why. And even if this culture avoided mass sacrifice, neighboring lands sometimes had few qualms about shedding blood for spiritual or political reasons. In early Mesopotamia, city-states rose around fertile regions near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Texts etched into clay tablets detail how kings and high priests ruled through strict codes. Some of these codes justified execution for minor theft or sacrilege, treating the lives of slaves and lower-class citizens as expendable. Public displays of punishment served to reinforce the idea that cosmic order hinged on respecting the gods and the king. Religious ceremonies included processions of idols, the reading of omens, and occasional sacrificial rites. People who questioned these events were seen as threats to society's stability. They might face torture or forced labor in distant quarries. Even though Mesopotamia was a cradle of writing and agriculture, it was also a land where fear secured obedience across vast stretches of territory. Scholars studying the Etruscans, an ancient people of the Italian peninsula, have uncovered evidence of rituals that involved animal or human offerings. Though overshadowed by Rome, the Etruscans influenced early Roman culture. Tomb paintings and artifacts point to a belief in an active afterlife. Etruscan priests were consulted about the will of the gods, interpreting lightning strikes or bird flights to guide decisions. While the surviving artwork mostly depicts banquets and lively events, certain scenes show bound captives who seem prepared for sacrifice, a reminder that these feasts could take a dark turn if the gods demanded blood. Later, as Rome expanded, some Etruscan practices were adopted, while others were banned or changed. Nonetheless, the traces of these rites speak to a worldview where the line between a celebration and a violent act was thin when divine signs indicated such measures were necessary. In the distant forests and mountains of northern Europe, early Germanic and Celtic peoples also engaged in acts that fueled both wonder and horror. Sagas and archaeological finds describe how warrior cults enacted ceremonies under moonlight or around roaring fires. Some involve the bog bodies, individuals whose remains have been discovered in peat bogs with signs of ritual killings, throats slit, limbs bound, or skulls crushed. These bodies were placed in marshy pits that preserved their features, including hair and even stomach contents. Scholars believe these people may have been criminals, prisoners, or sacrifices offered to deities associated with fertility and war. Items found alongside them, like wooden idols or weapons, suggest the killings served a symbolic function, securing good harvests or the favor of powerful spirits. The quiet marshes, once sites of these grim events, now yield their secrets when modern machinery cuts through layers of ancient peat. In the Greek world, some city-states conducted rites that might seem tame compared to the large-scale sacrifices recorded elsewhere. Yet Greek myths reference stories of kings forced to kill their offspring or strangers cast into labyrinths for monstrous creatures. While these might be fictional or exaggerated, historians note that the Greeks had several bloodless ceremonies but also a few that involved actual bloodshed. Animal sacrifice was routine, sometimes performed on grand altars during public festivals. Rarely, in times of dire crisis, humans were said to be sacrificed. One legend claims that during the siege of Troy, a Greek leader agreed to sacrifice his daughter for favorable winds. This tale reflects a broader belief that the gods demanded life in exchange for victory or survival. Although the historical veracity of such a story is debated, the concept itself shows how deeply fear and devotion could entwine. Traveling farther east, we find regions of ancient Japan where clan-based warfare and shamanistic rituals shaped daily life. Early texts mention Hitobashira, or human pillars, in which individuals were reportedly buried alive under or near large building projects, like bridges, dams, or castles, to appease spirits and protect the structure. Legends say these sacrifices kept disasters at bay, whether from floods or enemy attacks. Though some historians argue that many of these stories are folklore, a few local records describe suspicious burials at construction sites. These details suggest that the belief might have guided real practices at certain points in Japanese history. People who fell victim to these customs had little recourse, especially if chosen by local lords who viewed such offerings as essential to prevent calamities. Standing at these old sites today, one might never guess that human lives possibly became part of the foundation. On the steppes of Central Asia, nomadic tribes like the Scythians were known for brutal raids and cunning battle tactics. Ancient Greek authors commented on how Scythian warriors drank the blood of the first enemy killed in battle and made cups from the skulls of their most formidable foes. While some of these accounts may be exaggerated, archaeological finds confirm that they practiced ritualized violence, including the use of scalp trophies. They buried their chieftains in large kurgans, mound tombs, with horses and sometimes human servants, who were presumably killed to follow their masters. These funerary customs underscored the Scythians' belief that status in life should carry over into the afterlife. Although they traded with Greeks and Persians, they never fully adopted the settled customs of those civilizations, remaining fierce and feared until other powers rose to challenge them. In the mountains of Anatolia, the Hittites built an empire that vied with Egypt and Assyria. Texts preserved on baked clay tablets reveal complex laws and religious instructions. Some sections detail the blood of the firstborn practice, suggesting that in desperate times, the eldest child of a noble or a community leader might be offered to avert disaster. Whether this was widely carried out or reserved for dire emergencies is unclear, but the very mention indicates that such a possibility existed. Hittite records also discuss curses placed on captives, involving rituals intended to bind the defeated people's fate to the empire's success. These curses sometimes reference dismemberment or the scattering of body parts to prevent the spirits of captives from finding rest. If the procedure failed, the fear was that the restless ghost might harm the living. This shows the depth of Hittite concern about supernatural revenge. The Thracians, neighbors of both Greeks and Scythians, had a fearsome reputation. Greek historians wrote that the Thracians worshipped warlike gods and used violent rites to gain their favor. Some accounts mention the custom of sacrificing prisoners to these gods and drinking wine mixed with the victim's blood. Although it is hard to separate myth from reality in these tales, archaeological sites in Bulgaria and surrounding regions yield funerary complexes containing weapons, chariots, and occasionally multiple bodies arranged in ritual patterns. Art depicting armed horsemen and dynamic battle scenes suggests that violence was central to Thracian identity. The Greek writer Herodotus described how Thracian tribes might mourn a birth but celebrate a death, reflecting an outlook where life was fraught with hardship, and death was a release into a better realm. Under such a worldview, sending victims to the afterlife could carry religious significance beyond mere cruelty. In parts of early Africa outside Egypt, records are sparse but still provide glimpses of intense practices. The Nubian kingdoms, located south of Egypt along the Nile, engaged in wars with their northern neighbors and adapted some Egyptian customs. Tomb complexes in Nubia show that when a ruler died, members of the court might have been buried with him. Similar to the Egyptian practice during early dynastic periods, this signified the belief that servants had to continue serving in the next life. Farther west, along the Niger River, emerging chiefdoms may have used human sacrifice to consolidate political authority, though direct written records are absent. Oral traditions passed down through generations mention shrines that required blood offerings. Only when European travelers arrived centuries later did outsiders begin writing accounts of such practices, but by then, many had either vanished or been transformed by new influences. South of the Sahara, large-scale state formations were less common in very ancient times, but this did not mean societies were free from grim acts. Local clans might punish crimes or social transgressions with rituals involving forced drowning or slow death by spears around a ceremonial fire. Masks worn by secret societies played roles in these judgments, enhancing the fear factor. Those found guilty could be seized at night, taken to hidden groves, and never seen again. Stories of what happened in those places spread through whispers, ensuring others stayed in line. Later written documents suggest that these methods were as much about reinforcing the power of elders and ritual specialists as they were about supernatural beliefs. Heading to the Arabian Peninsula, we learn of tribes that practiced rites involving the disposal of enemies in desert wastelands. Some inscriptions hint at leaving captives tied to stakes under the hot sun, where dehydration and heat would claim their lives. Others mention certain corners of the peninsula where tribal gods demanded periodic bloodletting. While historical evidence is scattered, the overall picture shows that desert life was harsh, and resources were scarce. The threat of being left to die without water or shade served as a potent deterrent to those who might challenge local customs. In these areas, the line between environment and execution blurred, since nature itself could become a lethal instrument of punishment. Farther east, in regions that would become part of India, certain cults revered goddess figures associated with destruction and rebirth. Ancient records describe groups that performed sacrifices, sometimes human, to seek the favor of these powerful forces. Stone engravings and legends refer to cremation pits filled with offerings. In some interpretations, the goddess demanded life energy to protect the kingdom or ensure victory in war. Later Hindu traditions largely shifted these acts to animal sacrifice or symbolic rites, yet a few old stories and minor cult practices suggest that more severe offerings once existed. The knowledge of these earlier rites survived in folklore, warning that if the goddess was not appeased, disease, invasion, or famine might ensue. This belief in a deity whose appetite demanded blood underscored the widespread notion that supernatural powers needed constant placation. In Southeast Asia, early kingdoms that rose in areas now known as Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam also saw connections between rulership and divine favor. The temples of Angkor, constructed centuries later, provide some insight into earlier beliefs. Stone carvings show scenes of deities receiving offerings, but older layers beneath these sites might hint at more ominous customs predating the grand architecture. Some local myths speak of dragons or serpent gods requiring human brides or sacrificial victims. While these legends may be allegorical, they reflect real fears about natural disasters, floods, storms, and disease. Communities lacking scientific explanations sometimes concluded that supernatural agents demanded a human life to restore balance. With no other recourse, They handed over victims to forest shrines or river god statues, hoping to avert widespread catastrophe. Heading across the ocean to the islands of Polynesia, we find accounts that mention human sacrifice in various rituals connected to warfare or the commemoration of new sacred sites. Oral histories in Hawaii, Tahiti, and other archipelagos indicate that high chiefs or priests sometimes ordered the execution of prisoners or those of low status to appease the gods. The remains were offered at temple platforms or heiau, serving as a symbolic gift intended to secure divine protection for the community. Fear of disobeying the alii, chiefly class, and the priests kept these practices largely unquestioned. Only when European explorers arrived in the 18th century do we get outside accounts describing these ceremonies, though some records are tinged with bias. Still, the consistent references to blood offerings suggest that such customs were deeply entrenched. In the vast lands that now encompass modern Russia, early Slavic tribes worshipped nature deities tied to forests, rivers, and weather. Archaeological traces are limited, but medieval chronicles reference older rituals that included sacrificing animals and possibly humans at sacred groves. Sites have been found with wooden idols and pits that might have held remains. Over time, as Christianity spread, these practices were either suppressed or merged with Christian traditions. Still, local folklore about unclean spirits and the need to propitiate them points to a past where avoiding misfortune could involve offerings. The terror of angering forest or water spirits was as real as the fear of a tyrant's punishment. People believed that if rituals were neglected, storms, crop failures, or strange illnesses could devastate entire villages. Across many of these cultures, we see the recurring theme of blame and appeasement. When drought struck or disease spread, ancient communities searched for an explanation. Often, they concluded that humans had angered a divine force. Leaders, seeking to restore order, might choose sacrificial victims. Public support for such measures arose from desperation and superstition. The panic of seeing crops wither or livestock die pushed people to do things they might otherwise reject. The chosen victims were labeled sinners, witches, criminals, or war captives, making it easier for the populace to accept their fate. Onlookers believed that the gods demanded justice, and if blood was not spilled, the entire community might suffer. This mindset gave enormous power to those interpreting omens or claiming divine insight. Rulers who resisted these practices risked losing legitimacy. For instance, if a king decided to stop offering sacrifices during a famine and the famine persisted, subjects could accuse him of offending the gods. Revolts, assassinations, or the breakdown of order could follow. Thus, it was often safer to continue ritual killings, even if a monarch privately doubted their efficacy. The political cost of reform was too high. While some leaders did try to moderate extreme customs, perhaps limiting them to animal sacrifice or delaying them until certain conditions were met, the underlying logic of fear endured. As a result, changes came slowly, if at all, and only under specific circumstances, such as cultural shifts brought by new religions or conquering empires. Writings from ancient philosophers, though often idealistic, sometimes reflect an awareness of these brutal realities. A Greek thinker might extol virtues like moderation and reason, yet still accept the need for sacrifices under certain religious festivals. An Egyptian scribe could praise ma'at, order, and condemn chaos, while simultaneously describing the horrific punishments dealt to rebellious laborers. Sumerian legends weave tales of wise kings who built canals and expanded trade, but those same kings could order entire villages destroyed if they posed a threat. These contradictory attitudes make it clear that ancient societies lived in tension between developing high culture and practicing methods of control rooted in violence. Looking at the bigger picture, many of these customs fed on the same human impulses: fear of the unknown, the desire to propitiate higher forces, and the need to maintain strict order in the face of chaos. Natural disasters, invading armies, and epidemic diseases left people feeling helpless, prompting them to seek drastic solutions. Diviners or oracles played into this desperation by declaring that certain sacrifices would restore balance. Armies used brutality to maintain authority over captured regions. Local leaders believed cruelty was a practical means to prevent rebellion. And the majority population, lacking power or fearful of repercussions, complied. Even so, not everyone agreed. Some individuals tried to escape or sabotage these rituals. They fled to mountains, deserts, or foreign territories. In rare instances, small groups rose up against tyrants or religious officials, though they faced harsh retaliation. The seeds of doubt existed, carried by travelers who had witnessed different customs elsewhere. Perhaps someone who visited a distant land saw that certain peoples had fewer sacrifices or more lenient laws. This might spark the question, why do we continue such brutal practices at home? Nonetheless, the inertia of tradition kept most societies locked in place. The risk of defying official rituals was too great. Most people saw no clear path to change. Over time, shifting trade routes, external invasions, or the spread of new beliefs sometimes eroded these older customs. Missionaries from emerging religions might condemn human sacrifice as barbaric and gain followers among those who yearned for alternatives. Conquerors could impose their own laws, banning the local rites they deemed unprofitable or immoral. Gradual exchanges among different regions also introduced new ideas about governance, punishment, and the nature of the divine. But remnants of old fears often lingered beneath the surface. In some places, clandestine offerings continued, hidden from outside eyes. In others, myths and superstitions persisted, reflecting the memory of a time when bloodshed was necessary to keep the world from collapsing into chaos. When modern scholars uncover ancient cemeteries containing mass graves, or decode cryptic passages describing lost sacrificial rituals, they bring to light these shadows of the past. The old altars and ceremonial tools reveal practical details: the type of blade used, the arrangement of bodies, the presence of certain plants or animals. By analyzing DNA, archaeologists can identify relationships between victims, discovering that some were foreigners while others were local. This raises new questions about whether outsiders were preferred as offerings to spare local families, or if entire families were destroyed to serve a ritual function. Each new discovery adds to the record of human behavior at its most extreme, reminding us that beneath the works of art and feats of engineering, there was also a deep well of dread. The eerie power of these findings lies in their ability to connect modern people with those who lived so long ago. We see footprints left by villagers on old stone roads, next to altars stained with centuries of blood. We imagine the anxious crowds forced to watch a sacrifice, not daring to turn away or speak out. We picture parents trying to hide a beloved child from the priest's selection process, or a captured soldier closing his eyes in resignation as the crowd gathers. These scenes, though ancient, have an unsettling familiarity because they reflect universal fears and the lengths individuals will go to survive. The structures may be crumbling, the language is extinct, but the emotional weight behind these customs remains palpable. For some observers, learning about these practices can inspire a sense of relief that humanity has moved away from such extremes. Others caution that modern societies have their own hidden cruelties and forms of oppression. The ancient world's reliance on violent rituals may seem shocking, but parallels can be drawn to more recent events. Whether in the name of political ideology, racial purity, or other justifications, large groups have still been targeted and exterminated within living memory. While the tools and scale might differ, the underlying rationale, maintaining control and unity through fear, remains recognizable. Reflecting on these ancient precedents can be a sober reminder that humanity's capacity for harm has deep roots, and vigilance is needed to prevent new manifestations of terror. We also should note that not every culture resorted to these extremes at the same frequency. Some thrived by focusing on trade, diplomacy, and more benign religious expressions. But the historical record suggests that many societies at least flirted with such acts, especially in times of crisis. The bond between fear and control proved potent, and stories of dire punishments traveled far. These tales acted as cautionary messages across seas and deserts, shaping reputations that lingered long after the cultures themselves faded. Even if a people halted their worst rituals, neighboring lands might still repeat old rumors for generations, ensuring that the memory of brutality outlived any official ban. In this long panorama, modern archaeology and historical research serve as important tools for rediscovering lost truths. Human bones with cut marks, ancient platforms stained with residue, texts that speak of curses and doom, each piece can fill a gap in our understanding. Though the puzzle remains incomplete, enough fragments align to show that systematic violence was not an aberration but a recurring strategy. Leaders drew on the threat of terror to prevent dissent. Religious authorities insisted that only blood could satisfy divine demands. Populations, caught in the middle, had no real choice but to comply. It was a world where life could be snuffed out on an altar, a city gate, or a lonely road, all in the name of preserving order. Yet throughout this darkness, individuals found moments of hope or kindness. A guard might turn a blind eye to help someone escape. A community might gather resources to ransom a captive. A lone priest might question a ritual's necessity. While rare, such acts hint that even amid brutal systems, empathy and doubt existed. Over centuries, small gestures built momentum, sometimes influencing entire civilizations. A new religion might sweep through, introducing doctrines of compassion. A wise king might limit capital punishments or reduce sacrifice. In the grand scheme, these were exceptions. But they laid seeds that later generations could cultivate into broader reforms. Gradually, many once routine acts of horror receded, though not always disappearing entirely. Standing in the ruins of an ancient temple or fortress, one can sense the weight of these histories. The silent stones witness the cries of the condemned, the frantic prayers of those hoping to avoid selection, and the cold resolve of officials who carried out the commands. Time has muffled those voices, leaving behind only echoes. Our modern desire to understand them stems partly from curiosity, partly from a need to reckon with the legacies of human violence. Each new artifact pulled from the earth forces us to confront what our ancestors did, and why. It also challenges us to consider how the future might judge our own actions. At what point do cultural norms cross the line into cruelty? And how can societies break free from fear-based traditions once they take root? These reflections provide a sobering backdrop for the study of ancient cultures. While not all histories are steeped in blood, enough are to show that cruelty was a shared element across continents. It shaped political structures, justified warfare, and regulated spiritual practices. Far from being confined to a few fringe groups, it influenced major civilizations whose names still echo in our art and literature. Despite centuries of evolution, the ghosts of these customs still linger in human consciousness, warning that power without restraint can lead to unthinkable extremes. The uncovered bones and testimonies remind us that for many in the ancient world, the daily threat of terror was as real as the next sunrise. By acknowledging that reality, we gain a deeper understanding of where we come from and what we must guard against, lest we repeat those oldest of mistakes. Archaeologists and historians continue to piece together how fear influenced every level of ancient life, from small villages to sprawling empires. Across vast distances and diverse cultures, the certainty of punishment, whether by ritual sacrifice or public torture, shaped how people behaved. Individuals rarely acted outside the norms set by leaders and priests, because doing so might mean being labeled an outcast, a heretic, or a traitor. Over time, systems of rule grew more intricate, adding new ranks of officials and specialists who administered harsh justice on behalf of monarchs or high priests. Records, when they survive, provide glimpses of a world where cruelty was not a hidden affair but rather a sanctioned method to preserve a structured society. In early China, powerful dynasties rose and fell, each bringing distinctive ideas about law and punishment. The Shang dynasty left bone and tortoiseshell inscriptions revealing that royal diviners asked ancestors whether military campaigns or sacrificial rites would succeed. Archaeological digs at ancient Shang capitals, such as Anyang, uncovered pits filled with human skulls and skeletons. These remains often belonged to prisoners or war captives, with clear indications that they were killed in ceremonies. The people performing these rites believed that spirits influenced everything from harvests to royal fortunes. If a divination implied the need for blood, there was little hesitation. Later dynasties, like the Zhou, continued certain practices while refining others. They established rigid social hierarchies and legal codes that threatened amputation, execution, or forced labor for those who broke the rules. Although some rulers tried to temper these laws, the idea that fear was necessary for order lingered. In the Warring States period, rival kingdoms battled endlessly, each employing tactics to intimidate enemies and ensure loyalty within their own borders. Tales of entire cities put to the sword circulated widely, reminding populations that surrender could be more merciful than resistance. One example comes from the conquests of the Qin state, which eventually unified China under the first emperor. Historical sources claim that after capturing a stronghold, Qin generals executed large numbers of the defeated soldiers in public. This harsh approach spread panic and convinced other cities to open their gates without a fight. Once Qin Shi Huang seized power, he standardized laws and punishments even more strictly. Physical mutilation, forced labor on massive projects like the Great Wall, and the threat of secret informants created an atmosphere where families feared their own neighbors. Such a system helped the empire maintain dominance, but it also alienated many, setting the stage for revolt after the first emperor's death. On the other side of the world, the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica, predating the Maya and Aztecs, left behind colossal stone heads and ceremonial centers. While direct evidence of human sacrifice among the Olmec is still debated, certain sculptures and figurines hint that blood offerings were not unknown. Scholars base these interpretations on the poses of figures, some shown bound or prone, and on iconography that resembles later Mesoamerican practices. By examining skulls and bones in ceremonial areas, researchers have found injuries consistent with violent death. Whether this signified large-scale sacrifice or sporadic ritual killings remains uncertain. What is clear is that the roots of later, more documented practices of the Maya and Aztecs may stretch back to these early societies. This suggests a long tradition of connecting bloodshed to spiritual power, setting a precedent for future empires in the region. In ancient Korea, emerging kingdoms such as Goguryeo, Beech, and Silla were shaped by warfare and alliances. Local myths talk about heroic founders born of heaven, but they also include references to brutal punishments for anyone who opposed royal authority. Archaeological findings from burial mounds suggest that high-ranking individuals sometimes went to their tombs accompanied by attendants, weapons, and lavish objects. Although direct proof of large-scale human sacrifice is minimal, isolated accounts mention the possibility that servants might have been forced to enter the afterlife with their masters. Furthermore, once Buddhism spread, it offered new views on the sanctity of life, potentially clashing with older beliefs. Even so, many older customs adapted rather than disappeared, showing again how ancient practices could evolve but remain rooted in fear-based governance. Among the ancient Israelites, biblical texts refer to periods when some groups worshipped Canaanite deities and possibly carried out child sacrifices. The Bible condemns these actions and calls them abominations, particularly the offerings to a deity named Molech. Some historians argue that these passages reflect real practices, whereas others suggest they might be polemics aimed at demonizing rival religions. Archaeological evidence at certain sites in the Levant includes small burial jars that may hold infant remains. Debates persist over whether these represent child sacrifice or high infant mortality and subsequent special burials. Regardless, the persistent theme in these texts and debates is that sacrificing children was considered among the most terrifying acts a community could commit, provoking either the wrath or condemnation of neighboring peoples. Fear of divine punishment, or fear of being labeled a heretic, thus shaped how different groups approached ritual slaughter, reinforcing cultural boundaries in a region already rife with conflict. In the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, ancient kingdoms like DMT and later Aksum developed distinctive traditions. While these states are famous for monumental obelisks and early Christian adoption, they also inherited older Cushitic and Semitic customs. Inscriptions mention strict rules enforced by rulers claiming both political and religious power. Violations could result in slavery or public executions. There are scattered references to offerings during coronations or major building projects, though the exact nature of these rituals is only partially understood. As Aksum shifted toward Christianity, many older rites were either absorbed into church traditions or abandoned. Still, the memory of earlier times, when kings might have relied on blood sacrifices or violent punishments, can be traced in local legends about wicked rulers overshadowed by saintly figures who brought new laws. In the world of the Arabian Peninsula before Islam, multiple tribes worshipped various gods, each with its shrines and rituals. Mecca housed the Kaaba, which, even before it became a central Islamic site, contained idols and drew pilgrims from across the region. Some accounts mention that certain clans might sacrifice animals or, in rare circumstances, humans to gain favor in trade and warfare. Raids were common, and captive enemies could face a grim fate. Honor codes often demanded vengeance for killed kinsmen, creating cycles of violence. Once Islam emerged, the new religious teachings opposed human sacrifice, although warfare and conquest continued for other reasons. This transformation again highlights how a single shift in religious or political ideology could reshape centuries-old customs of fear-based rule, replacing them with new systems that had their own forms of control. In the British Isles, the old practices of the Picts, pre-Roman Britons, and various Celtic tribes left few written records. Caesar and other Roman authors described druids who presided over ceremonies involving the burning of captives in large wicker structures, although modern scholars debate the scale of this practice. Archaeological evidence in certain areas does show unusual mass burials and remains that could indicate sacrifice. Hill forts and sacred groves might have hosted gatherings where offerings to war gods took place before battles, aiming to secure victory. Many of these traditions faded under Roman occupation and, later, Christianization, but local folklore carried fragments into later centuries. Medieval stories sometimes refer to secret rituals in remote forests, referencing an older time when fear of druidic curses or retribution shaped how people behaved. Moving south, the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean coasts saw trade networks that connected East Africa, Arabia, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent. Ports along these routes became melting pots of cultural exchange, yet they also featured local rulers who enforced tough regulations on sailors and merchants. Travelers who broke local laws might be sold into slavery or offered to satisfy local rituals meant to ensure smooth sailing and commercial success. The logs of Greek, Roman, and later Arab traders contain notes about strange altars and fearsome rites in certain coastal towns. Because merchants depended on good relations with local chiefs, they sometimes turned a blind eye to these customs, prioritizing profit and personal safety. This interplay of commerce and terror shows how fear could become a currency, just like gold or spices, shaping alliances and trade practices across oceans. In Central Europe, the lands that later became Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic were home to tribal confederations described by Roman historians. They mention human heads placed on stakes at village entrances and ritual feasts that involved blood rites. Forest clearings served as gathering spots where chieftains and priests decided on war or alliances, often following omens interpreted from animal entrails. If the signs were bad, a sacrifice, sometimes even a highborn prisoner, might be declared necessary. In mountainous regions, caves held altars where valuables and possibly human remains have been discovered by modern cavers. These findings show that for many Central European groups, contacting the spirit world or the pantheon of tribal gods sometimes meant ending a human life. Though the specifics varied by tribe, the unifying thread was the belief that fearsome acts maintained harmony between the moral realm and supernatural forces. Scandinavian sources, besides the tales of blood eagles and violent raids, mention large-scale sacrifices at places like Uppsala in what is now Sweden. According to medieval chroniclers, offerings took place every 9 years, with animals and, in some accounts, humans hanged from the branches of sacred trees. Although the exact historical accuracy of these descriptions is debated, archaeological finds at certain sacrificial bogs, including remains of both animals and humans, support the notion that the Old Norse peoples made real offerings to their gods. Kings seeking favor before battles or during famines might sanction bigger sacrifices. The presence of items such as valuable weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial boats also points to a culture where wealth and life could be given up in an attempt to secure divine backing. The environment of cold, dark winters and unpredictable seas only heighten the sense that appeasing powerful spirits was crucial. To the far south, the Andean highlands beyond the Inca realm hosted various cultures. The Chachapoya, sometimes called the Cloud People, built cliffside tombs that still fascinate researchers. They lived in areas of dense fog and steep mountains, constantly at risk from expansionist empires or harsh weather. Evidence of sacrificed individuals has been found in certain remote tomb complexes, suggesting that communal crisis or the death of a leader could trigger the call for offerings. The skeletons sometimes bear cut marks or signs of blunt trauma consistent with ritual killing. Grave goods, including fine textiles and ceramics, accompany them, indicating these sacrifices were high-status events. Oral histories among local descendants mention that ghosts of the sacrificed roam the cliffs, further reflecting how fear extends beyond the living and into the realm of spirits. The spread of major religions like Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam gradually reshaped many older practices. Missionaries and religious authorities insisted that true faith did not require human victims, challenging the foundation of certain rites. Over time, new laws targeted those who continued blood sacrifices, labeling them as heretics or pagans. In some regions, these efforts succeeded, eradicating the worst rituals. However, in other areas, the old ways persisted underground, fused with the new faith in a complex blend. There are documented cases in medieval Europe of secret gatherings where people sacrificed animals or, very rarely, a person, believing they were following ancient customs suppressed by the church. In East Asia, rumored practices of ghost brides and hidden shrines continued, despite official condemnation. This duality shows that fear-driven traditions do not simply vanish, they adapt, going deeper into the shadows when challenged by external forces. Anthropologists studying remote communities in modern times have occasionally recorded the remnants of such ancient traditions. Instances of blood offerings or protective sacrifices appear in small pockets of remote forests or mountain enclaves. Though highly controversial and often illegal, some groups believe these acts ward off disease or natural disasters, echoing the mindsets of distant ancestors who felt no other choice but to appease unseen powers. When discovered, these pockets of ritual violence sparked debates over cultural preservation versus human rights. Governments and local authorities may respond with crackdowns, or in some cases, they might turn a blind eye, unwilling to confront centuries-old beliefs. This tension highlights how the fear of angering spirits remains potent in certain corners of the world. rulers throughout history often justified cruelty by saying it was for the greater good. At times, it served as a unifying force, albeit one built on terror. People living under these regimes sometimes found solidarity in mutual fear, forming tight community bonds to survive. Ritual specialists or priests, revered and feared in equal measure, could use their influence to direct public sentiment. By announcing omens that demanded sacrifice, they manipulated the psychology of the masses. A scapegoat, perhaps a foreign captive or a social outcast, could be offered to quell communal anxieties. In that sense, these sacrifices were more than cruel spectacles. They were attempts to channel widespread panic into a single, horrifying event, after which people might feel cleansed or reassured, at least temporarily. This cycle repeated, creating a grim stability reliant on the threat of lethal consequences. Such violence took a toll. The survivors, especially the children who witnessed these events, grew up carrying trauma that shaped how they raised their own families. Memoirs carved into stone or written on papyrus sometimes mention nightmares, hauntings, or curses that followed sacrificial killings. Even some priests expressed doubts in private, though they dared not voice them openly. In certain societies, an undercurrent of dread seeped into art, folklore, and daily speech. Words became coded so that people could avoid mentioning frightening rites directly, using euphemisms instead. This emotional strain is rarely captured in grand monuments or official propaganda, which usually celebrate the power of the rulers. However, archaeological contexts, like the remains of hastily buried victims or the personal tokens found near execution sites, hint at the sorrow that spread through families. These fragments remind us that behind every official order to spill blood stood real individuals whose lives were cut short by a system they could not defy. Trade networks, too, played a role in spreading tales of horror. Merchants who traversed deserts, seas, and mountain passes carried stories of terrifying customs in foreign lands. Some accounts were exaggerated or distorted to impress listeners back home. Others were chillingly accurate, describing altars drenched in blood or moats filled with bones. Over time, these stories formed a sort of negative map of the known world, with certain regions labeled as especially cruel. Those seeking fortune might venture in any way, hoping the local rulers would spare them. Such travelers took precautionary gifts or tributes, hoping to ingratiate themselves. In some places, paying these tributes was a cost of doing business. In the worst scenarios, if tribute failed, the merchants themselves could be seized for ritual use, a stark reminder that no one was safe if they landed in the wrong place at the wrong time. Through it all, ingenuity in cultural development persisted, proving that fear, while powerful, did not halt human creativity. Grand temples rose, advanced irrigation systems spread farmland, and philosophies emerged that questioned the status quo. The tension between progress and cruelty is a hallmark of many ancient civilizations. A single city might feature advanced engineering next to a plaza for public executions. Philosophers and poets might refine language in an environment where a wrong word could mean death. This paradoxical coexistence shows that brutality did not always stem from ignorance alone. It could also thrive among sophisticated, literate societies that valued art, mathematics, or astronomy. Fear was not limited to unorganized tribes. It was often formalized in the halls of powerful states, woven into legal codes and religious canons. Revolts against these practices did happen, albeit rarely. In some historical moments, a charismatic leader convinced enough followers that the gods did not require blood, or that the ruler had overstepped. Such revolts sometimes succeeded in toppling regimes, only to replace them with another order that might continue or slightly modify the traditions of terror. The cycle was hard to break. Even if initial reforms took hold, banning certain types of sacrifice or reducing the severity of punishments, later rulers or priests could revert to old methods whenever famine, invasion, or political turbulence resurfaced. Hence, the enduring nature of these customs, which often lay dormant, waiting for a crisis that would call them back into action. Today, researchers try to unravel the complexities behind these ancient rites. Some argue that a strong psychological component was at work. The sense of shared guilt or relief after a sacrifice might have bonded communities. Others note the socio-political advantages that leaders reaped. The unpredictability of these events also kept populations on edge, ensuring compliance. Meanwhile, a portion of the priesthood may have sincerely believed in the necessity of ritual killing, convinced that the cosmic forces demanded it. Understanding all these angles requires careful reading of texts, detailed study of human remains, and a willingness to confront disturbing truths about what people can justify in the name of order or faith. Another angle involves the environment. Ancient societies faced natural disasters like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, droughts, and floods without modern scientific explanations. They saw these catastrophes as signs that the gods were displeased. Human sacrifice or brutal penalties might have been desperate attempts to control what seemed uncontrollable. By offering the best victims, often described as the purest, the healthiest, or the most skilled, communities hoped to persuade higher powers to spare them. Ironically, these same tragedies sometimes disrupted entire regions, making it even harder to keep the system of fear intact. If a massive flood washed away farmland despite a sacrifice, priests had to scramble for new excuses or scapegoats, further fueling the cycle of terror and justification. When we consider how these customs span continents and eras, a pattern emerges. No region was immune to the idea that shedding blood could maintain stability. Some societies practiced it more widely than others, but few were entirely free from violent traditions. In each place, a unique blend of religion, politics, and social pressure carved out a specific approach to terrifying acts. Whether an elaborate ceremony with priestly chants or a quick execution at a city gate, the shared outcome was to instill obedience. In many senses, this approach worked. Entire empires flourished for centuries, their roads, monuments, and legacies built on a bedrock of fear. Yet, the eventual decline of human sacrifice and extreme public torture in many parts of the world suggests that alternative methods of control emerged. Administrations learned to rely on taxation, bureaucratic oversight, and standing armies rather than constant displays of lethal force. Religions that stressed compassion, salvation, or karmic justice grew in influence, redirecting social norms. Over the long arc of history, these shifts reduced the frequency of ritual killings, though punishment by death remained common in legal systems. People began to believe that courts and structured laws were more reliable than interpreting bird flights or reading goat entrails to decide someone's fate. Even so, the remnants of older practices pop up in stories, local rites, and certain underground ceremonies, reminding us that the line between modern governance and ancient terror can be surprisingly thin. In many museums today, artifacts from these periods are displayed with labels describing their function or symbolic meaning. Yet the raw intensity of how they were used often hides behind glass. Ceremonial knives might seem beautiful, gilded with precious metals, but they once spilled real blood on temple altars. Ornate masks might impress visitors, but they could have been worn by executioners or priests presiding over human offerings. A careful reading of the museum tags may give brief hints about these realities, but the full weight of the fear that once hung over entire populations is hard to convey. It is only through archaeological context and historical texts that we grasp how deeply these objects were intertwined with cruelty. Modern fascination with these frightening practices appears in films, novels, and games, sometimes sensationalizing real suffering for entertainment. While such portrayals can raise awareness, they may also distort the complexities of ancient life. It is crucial to remember that, for those who lived under these systems, there was nothing entertaining about the threat of a sacrificial blade or the sight of a neighbor led to execution. Children grew up with nightmares that the gods might demand them next, and parents had few ways to protect their families if an official or priest decided fate required a victim. This was not a distant rumor, it was a living possibility that shaped where people lived, how they worshipped, and how they interacted with each other. Even so, these ancient peoples left behind remarkable achievements. Many used the same organizational skills that planned ceremonial killings to erect pyramids, chart stars, and form trade networks. Some wrote epics about honor and justice, even as they condoned or ignored the terror around them. We see sculptures of kings or pharaohs that project calm authority, yet those same rulers might have signed edicts condemning thousands to die. It is a paradox that still resonates in modern times. Human ingenuity can reach dazzling heights while cruelty persists in the background. Understanding this duality can help us see ancient cultures as neither purely savage nor wholly admirable, but rather as complex societies struggling with fear, belief, and survival, much as people do today. The shift away from mass sacrifice and extreme punishment was not linear or uniform. In some places, these traditions vanished quickly under external influence or internal reform. In others, they metamorphosed into subtler forms of intimidation. The specter of state-sponsored violence continued to hover, as public executions, torture, and mutilation remained integral parts of legal systems for centuries. Only with the spread of ideologies emphasizing individual rights and human dignity did a more systematic push against such brutality gain real traction. Even then, pockets of violence remain, a reminder that the ancient approach of controlling populations through fear has not entirely disappeared. Observers who study warfare and repressive regimes see echoes of these old methods in the modern world, proving their enduring power. Yet every relic, be it a dusty blade, a bone with cut marks, or a stone inscription cursing anyone who disturbs a tomb, tells a story of how people fought to make sense of a dangerous and uncertain environment. By uncovering these artifacts, we step into the shoes of those who lived so long ago, grappling with nightmares that were all too real. A single skeleton in a sacrificial pit can spark 100 questions. Who was this person? Were they a captive, a volunteer seeking honor, or someone unlucky enough to be born into the wrong family? Did they cry out for mercy? Did onlookers believe this was necessary for their survival? Each question goes unanswered, yet the remains reveal that real blood was spilled for reasons that, at the time, seemed vital to the community. In the broader arc of history, these frightening facts serve as a powerful lesson about the capacity for violence in any society. They are cautionary tales about the lengths humans will go to regain a sense of control over natural and social chaos. They also highlight how deep belief can justify actions that appear shocking or cruel to outsiders. As we uncover these stories, we confront the unsettling truth that terror has long been a tool in the human toolbox, used not only by savage warlords but also by refined cultures that shaped art and science. Each piece of evidence, whether a crumbling temple wall or a battered skull, reminds us that we share a lineage with those who thought bloodshed could hold the universe together. Some observers wonder how people in ancient times balanced ordinary routines with these grim practices. Historical and archaeological research suggests that fear and violence were often compartmentalized, allowing communities to function in day-to-day life despite the looming threat of brutal customs. Farming, trade, marriage ceremonies, and festivals continued in most places, yet if leadership declared a sacrifice or punishment, everything stopped until the deed was done. This tension between normalcy and terror appears in diverse regions, revealing just how ingrained such traditions could become when leaders and priests believed they were preserving cosmic or social order. Archaeological layers sometimes contain chilling reminders of this duality. At a site in what is now Turkey, scholars found the ruins of homes, ovens, and grain storage areas next to a pit filled with human skeletons showing signs of violent death. The same settlement included art depicting peaceful scenes of animals and harvests. Researchers theorize that periods of calm rural life were punctuated by bursts of violence, either from warfare or from ritual killings. When the community felt threatened by a crisis such as drought, invasion, or plague, leaders might decide that gods or spirits needed appeasing. In these moments, ordinary daily life gave way to the terror of ritual or retribution, leaving behind a stark contrast for future generations to discover. In the ancient Aegean, the Minoan civilization on Crete is known for its palaces and vibrant frescoes. These artworks portray dancing, sports like bull leaping, and lush surroundings. Yet some underground chambers, discovered beneath these palace complexes, contain evidence suggesting animal or possibly human sacrifices. One site showed remains of a youth whose bones had cut marks implying deliberate butchery. While interpretations vary, it raises the possibility that even this sophisticated culture resorted to sacrificing captives or local individuals during emergencies. Minoan myths that later evolved into Greek legends speak of the Minotaur, a bull-headed creature locked in a labyrinth, fed with human tributes. Though mythic, it reflects deeper beliefs that important rites may have involved shedding blood beneath the lavish palace floors. Whether to honor a god or stave off disaster, such acts remind us that a civilization's polished surface could hide frightening depths. In the Mycenaean world of mainland Greece, tablets written in Linear B mostly record mundane transactions: how many sheep were allocated for textile production, or how much grain was stored. At the same time, certain entries reference offerings for the gods. The language is sparse, so it remains uncertain whether these included human victims. The destruction layers at Mycenaean palaces hint at a violent end to this era, possibly from warfare, earthquakes, or internal strife. Some skeletons found in collapsed structures show signs of wounds inflicted in battle, while others may point to sacrificial rituals carried out in desperate times. As the palatial system fell, many old practices vanished or transformed, paving the way for the later emergence of what we call classical Greece. But the underlying idea, that blood could sway divine forces, did not simply disappear. Instead, it lingered in corners of Greek religion and re-emerged in times of crisis, fueling the myths that formed the backbone of Greek storytelling. The ancient Iranian plateau hosted the Elamites, who vied with Mesopotamian powers. Elamite inscriptions and artwork are limited, yet one surviving record notes the capture of foreign armies whose leaders were sometimes humiliated or executed as offerings to please the Elamite pantheon. Reliefs depict chains of prisoners being marched through cities, their fate decided by priest-kings. One text mentions a great cleansing ritual, though the details are missing. Scholars think it might have involved sacrificing selected prisoners to celebrate a victory or to ward off future rebellions. When later Persian dynasties arose, they sometimes denounced earlier brutal customs, but echoes of such methods persisted in local folklore, carrying forward the notion that divine wrath could be quelled by moral suffering. In the region south of the Caspian Sea, the ancient Hyrcanians and neighboring tribes lived in mountainous terrain that offered natural defenses. Greek accounts portray them as fierce warriors who performed decapitations of enemies to display heads as trophies. Some sources even claim these tribes roasted and ate parts of fallen foes. While these stories may contain exaggerations, archaeological sites in that area do feature scattered human and animal remains in ritual contexts, supporting the idea of some form of sacrificial or cannibalistic practice. Wars with powerful neighbors forced these mountain peoples to rely on terror tactics, using frightening reputations to ward off invaders. Such methods were a deterrent, since potential conquerors had to weigh the risk of encountering not just standard warfare but also ritual atrocities. Over time, as large empires consolidated, these tribes either integrated or lost their distinct practices. Still, for centuries, travelers told tales of savage rites in the mountains, creating a legend of dread that far outlasted the actual societies. Meanwhile, along the Nile farther south from Egypt, the Kushite kingdom sometimes battled their northern neighbors and sometimes allied with them. Kushite rulers adopted many Egyptian symbols, styling themselves as heirs to the pharaohs. They built pyramids at Meroe and left inscriptions praising their gods. Certain reliefs show enemies captured in battle, shackled, and led to temple precincts. While direct records of human sacrifice remain limited, references to oblations and blood for the gods hint that such events might have occurred to commemorate major military triumphs. Excavations at burial sites reveal the remains of servants or dependents placed in tombs of elite individuals. This continuity from earlier Nubian traditions reflects the same notion repeated elsewhere: the powerful did not travel to the afterlife alone, they took company by force. The dual role of a Kushite king, part god, part conqueror, justified harsh methods to maintain order in the uncertain border zones between multiple empires. In some ancient Indian contexts, older texts like certain sections of the Atharva Veda mention rituals intended to harm enemies or gain favor from deities. While large-scale human sacrifice was never as institutionally common there as in parts of Mesoamerica, scattered references point to occasional offerings. An example is the story of a king who sacrifices a human in a special rite for ensuring prosperity, though historians debate whether such acts were ever widespread or merely symbolic. Later practices, like sati, the ritual immolation of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre, though more associated with medieval and early modern periods, may have roots in ancient ideas about offering one's life to uphold cosmic or social balance. Over time, philosophical and religious developments in the Indian subcontinent discouraged direct blood sacrifices in many mainstream traditions, especially those influenced by Jain and Buddhist teachings. Still, local variants could persist in rural areas, performed in secret or hidden behind other rites. In certain parts of Southeast Asia, the Kingdom of Kampa, in what is now Vietnam, and various Malay polities had complex spiritual beliefs mixing indigenous animism with Hindu or Buddhist elements. Temple inscriptions in Sanskrit and Old Cham languages refer to offerings made to Shiva or local deities. While many inscriptions focus on gifts of gold, livestock, and crops, scattered lines hint at darker acts. Rulers described how they subdued rebellious subjects or captured foreign soldiers, bringing them before the temple altars. Sometimes these captives were simply executed, but in other references, there are cryptic phrases about the final breath offered to the gods. Whether this meant formalized sacrifice or a poetic way of describing punishment is unclear. But the link between religious devotion and violent retribution appears throughout these records, reflecting a pattern consistent with other ancient societies. Meanwhile, coastal trade networks exposed Kampa and its neighbors to influences from China, India, and the Middle East, potentially moderating or amplifying these practices depending on shifting political alliances. Moving to the vast forests and rivers of ancient Russia, the Finno-Ugric and Slavic tribes there conducted ceremonies centered on nature spirits. Archaeological digs reveal wooden idols placed in marshes or lakes, alongside bones from large animals. Some accounts from early travelers suggest that during times of famine or plague, these tribes might select a person to give back to the forest or water spirits. Although concrete evidence is scarce, the repeated mentions of human remains and ritual deposits support the possibility. Such sacrifices aim to quell supernatural forces believed to dwell in the wild. Long winters, dangerous predators, and the difficulty of sustaining large settlements meant that people sought every advantage to survive. Fear of these primal forces shaped local rites, teaching each generation that appeasing spirits was the surest way to prevent calamities. As more structured principalities like Kievan Rus emerged, Christianization pushed many of these practices to the margins, yet folk tales held on to the memory of older customs for centuries. In Mesoamerica, the Toltecs are described in later Aztec lore as both cultural heroes and ferocious warriors. Aztec texts credit the Toltecs with advanced knowledge of art, agriculture, and astronomy, but also hint that their religious ceremonies included human offerings. Statues found at sites like Tula depict imposing figures that may have once guarded temples. Bas-reliefs show eagles and jaguars, possibly referencing warrior orders that captured enemies for sacrifice. Though Toltec history is partly obscured by legend, their legacy influenced the Aztecs, who revered them as ancestors. If the Aztecs indeed modeled some of their own customs on Toltec precedents, it suggests a continuity of blood rituals over several centuries, leading to the large-scale sacrifices observed by the Spanish in the early 16th century. The Aztecs, building on older foundations, turned these ceremonies into a central pillar of their empire, merging fear and faith into one powerful institution. In the early Celtic world, bards and druids wielded great influence, shaping social and spiritual life. Roman and Greek writers mention the druids' role in conducting sacrifices, though there is still debate about whether these accounts are exaggerated propaganda. Some archaeological finds, however, strongly suggest that the Celts did practice ritual executions. The bog bodies in regions once inhabited by Celtic tribes sometimes display clear signs of a triple death: strangulation, throat cutting, and blunt force trauma. Scholars propose that this triple method was symbolic, possibly dedicated to three principal gods or representing three realms: earth, sky, and underworld. The fact that these bodies were preserved in bogs might indicate an offering to the land spirits, as wetlands were often deemed portals to supernatural domains. When Rome expanded into Gaul and Britain, it systematically dismantled many Druidic traditions, seeing them as a threat to imperial authority. Still, pockets of the old ways likely persisted long after official suppression, kept alive in local rites and stories passed down quietly. In the Middle East, the Nabateans built Petra, a city famous for its rock-cut architecture. Carved facades and hidden temples speak to a sophisticated culture tied to caravan trade routes. Yet archaeologists have uncovered altars and stone basins at high places above Petra that seem designed for blood rituals. Some inscriptions refer to the gods Dashura and Al-Uzza, among others. Animal sacrifice was certainly common, but a few references hint at more ominous offerings. Bones found near these high places occasionally include fragments of human remains. While not conclusive, it suggests that in dire situations, human life might have been offered to ensure the city's prosperity or the protection of trade convoys. As trade brought wealth, it also brought new ideas. The Nabateans eventually faced Roman conquest, and their distinct rites faded into obscurity, leaving behind only scattered clues that something darker once lurked beneath the grandeur of Petra's monuments. On the Arabian Peninsula, the city-states of what is now Yemen flourished with agriculture supported by elaborate irrigation systems like the Marib Dam. Sabaeans, Katabanians, and other groups built temples dedicated to their gods, often adorned with inscriptions praising rulers who maintained the irrigation works. Some texts include words of thanks after successful harvests or military victories. A few mention that the blood of men was poured out to secure these blessings, but the details remain sparse. Similar to other regions, the pattern suggests that in times of desperation, drought, war, or internal rebellion, leaders turned to terrifying acts. They believed that the gods, who controlled rainfall in a harsh environment, demanded serious offerings to restore balance. If the dam collapsed or water supplies dwindled, the entire community faced ruin. Under such pressure, moral concerns about killing captives or even certain criminals might have been set aside in favor of survival, continuing a pattern seen worldwide. Heading to the African continent beyond the Nile region, the Nok culture in West Africa produced remarkable terracotta sculptures that date back over 2,000 years. Little is known from written sources, as they had no surviving written language. Excavations unearthed these statues alongside evidence of ironworking. Some of the terracotta pieces depict human figures in expressions of pain or with bound limbs, suggesting they may have been related to ancestral or ritual veneration. Direct proof of human sacrifice remains inconclusive, but oral traditions preserved by later West African societies sometimes reference older customs of offering slaves or war captives to secure blessings for the land. Whether the Nak did so remains speculative, but the possibility aligns with broader themes in antiquity. Over time, newer kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai rose, bringing Islam or syncretic beliefs that blended older practices with new ones, possibly curtailing large-scale offerings while retaining the idea of appeasing powerful spirits. In the Americas outside Mesoamerica, cultures in the southwestern region of what is now the United States, including the ancestral Puebloans, Hohokam, and Mogollon, constructed intricate cliff dwellings and irrigation systems in desert landscapes. Many sites contain kivas, circular ceremonial chambers that housed communal or spiritual activities. While the bulk of artifacts suggest agricultural and community-focused life, a few excavations uncovered mass graves with unusual cut marks. Some researchers propose that these might be evidence of small-scale ritual cannibalism or warfare-related atrocities. The debate is intense, as others argue they represent reburials or defensive killings during resource conflicts. Still, the existence of these heavily contested remains underscores the reality that violence and spiritual practices could merge, even among societies known more for their remarkable stone villages and intricate trade in pottery and turquoise. Environmental stress, such as droughts, might have prompted groups to adopt harsher customs, at least temporarily, to control their fate. Far to the south, the Nazca of coastal Peru are renowned for their huge geoglyphs, best seen from above. They also left behind trophy heads, possibly collected in raids or as sacrificial objects. Preserved heads often have a hole in the forehead, allowing them to be strung on cords. Artistic depictions on Nazca pottery show individuals holding these heads, sometimes next to plants or water symbols. Scholars think the Nazca used them in fertility rites, believing the essence of the victim's life could nourish the land. While not necessarily large-scale sacrifice, the repeated portrayal of severed heads in an agricultural context indicates that a connection existed between violent acts and survival. The lines drawn across the desert may have been part of ceremonies honoring local deities or ancestors, further blending the creative and the gruesome in a single cultural framework. Over the centuries, shifting climate conditions or invasions forced the Nazca to adapt or migrate, but the archaeological record preserves these haunting glimpses of how far they might go to secure prosperity. Another example arises with the Tarim Basin mummies in what is now Xinjiang, China. These well-preserved remains, some with strikingly Caucasoid features, reveal a mix of cultural influences from nearby regions. Archaeological digs show evidence of textile production, trade in metals, and possibly horse breeding. Signs of violent death appear on certain mummies, though it is not always clear if they were executed, sacrificed, or simply killed in conflict. One female mummy was found buried with a small child, both showing wounds that could suggest a ritual context or an episode of sudden violence. The dryness of the desert left bodies in a near-perfect state, capturing details that highlight the harshness of life on the edges of multiple empires. Surrounding them were items of daily life, weaving together the routine tasks of survival with the chilling reality that, in a moment of crisis, death could be forced upon anyone. In Arabia's southern deserts, the Hadramaut region produced incense and precious commodities. Tribal coalitions sometimes battled for control of caravan routes. Strabo and other classical authors mention local kings who punished thieves or smugglers in severe ways, stoning, crucifixion, or ritual beheadings in front of temples. Incense trade was vital, and the caravans needed protection from raiders. By displaying brutal punishments in public, the authorities hoped to discourage attacks on merchants. Temples received a share of trade profits, strengthening alliances between rulers and priests. If an omen indicated the gods demanded more, captured raiders could be ceremonially executed. This arrangement tied the economy directly to religious terror, merging commerce with the ancient idea that spilled blood could ensure stability in a place where resources and security were fragile. Even within major empires, certain subgroups maintained older rites that mainstream authority struggled to control. In the Roman Empire, for instance, many conquered peoples still observed local festivals or worshipped ancestral gods. Roman officials might look the other way as long as taxes were paid and public order remained intact. But if an uprising occurred, the empire would respond with extreme force. Sometimes, after crushing a revolt, the victors forced local leaders to offer themselves or select members of their community for sacrifice to Roman gods, or they simply executed them in large-scale spectacles at amphitheaters. These events combined Roman power with local traditions, reinforcing to onlookers that the empire claimed authority over both the land and the spirits who inhabited it. The same principle applied along Rome's eastern frontiers, where generals engaged with client kingdoms that had their own sacrificial customs. Cultural exchange did not always mean less violence, sometimes it provided new reasons and methods for it. The existence of these practices across so many regions prompts questions about human psychology. Did people believe that sacrificing a life truly altered fate, or did they use it as a social tool? Many studies suggest the two ideas merged. Community members were taught from childhood that the gods demanded offerings in exchange for protection or favor. Rulers and priests benefited from the arrangement, centralizing power through religious authority. The fear of supernatural wrath kept dissenters in line, and those who tried to flee faced the reality that in many other lands, similar systems prevailed. The recurrence of these methods in unrelated cultures implies that reliance on blood rituals can arise independently wherever survival feels precarious. Whether threatened by drought, war, disease, or the unknown, societies often latched onto the notion that a sacrifice could solve existential problems. As time passed and some cultures developed written moral codes or were influenced by religions promoting compassion, the scale of these sacrifices sometimes diminished. Philosophers and reformers questioned whether the gods truly desired bloodshed. Yet even then, states kept capital punishment, public executions, and large-scale displays of violence to handle criminals or rebels. The boundary between a judicial killing and a ritual one could blur, as official ceremonies still invoked divine approval. For the victim, it made little difference. The sword or blade fell regardless, while spectators reconciled the act with moral teachings by labeling the condemned as transgressors against divine or earthly laws. In some places, a substitute victim system emerged, where a convicted person might be offered to the gods in lieu of the community at large. This arrangement merged legal and sacred frameworks into a single event of lethal force. Meanwhile, a few societies managed to channel anxieties into symbolic substitutes. Instead of killing a person, they might sacrifice an effigy or an animal. Festivals that once required human victims could evolve into more benign celebrations. This occurred in parts of the ancient Middle East, where older myths about sacrificing a king's son gave way to ceremonies involving a lamb or goat. Though progress, it still revolved around the same central idea, the notion that death, real or symbolic, was required to restore harmony. Over many generations, these changes spread, reducing the frequency of actual human sacrifices but not eliminating the underlying mindset. Even in present-day religious traditions, remnants of these beliefs appear in symbolic rituals, though humanity largely moved away from spilling real human blood for spiritual reasons in most regions. Nonetheless, the fear that fueled these ancient terrors can be traced forward into other forms of violence or persecution. Witch hunts, which flourished in medieval and early modern Europe, invoked the same principle of communal fear, that an invisible threat, this time, black magic, required extreme measures. Though not always classified as a continuation of human sacrifice, the mindset that a single victim's death might purge evil from society mirrored the older logic. The difference was that religious authorities now labeled the victims as witches or heretics rather than offerings to appease gods. In certain regions, mass executions of heretics operated as a grim public spectacle, reminiscent of earlier amphitheater killings. This shift from open sacrifice to judicial burning or hanging showed that while forms changed, fear remained a potent tool. Across cultures, the weight of this history shaped artistic traditions. Some ancient dramas likely had roots in ritual performances that once featured real deaths. Over time, they turned into theatrical reenactments, with fictional blood replaced by stage effects. Masks, once worn by priests or executioners in ceremonies, evolved into props for storytelling. The audience still felt the old tension, but in a safer, controlled environment. In some ways, these performances served as a release valve. Instead of watching a genuine sacrifice, people watched a symbolic depiction, allowing them to confront deep-seated fears without real bloodshed. The echoes of such transformations can be seen in modern theater and film, where violent themes attract viewers seeking to understand or experience fear in a contained setting. While these modern forms are voluntary entertainment, they have ancient roots in the communal fascination with life, death, and the unknown. Today's scholars continue to sort through these complexities, uncovering fresh evidence through advanced techniques like DNA analysis and ground-penetrating radar. When an excavation reveals a mass grave, researchers painstakingly examine each skeleton for signs of forced trauma, disease, or malnutrition. By mapping strontium isotopes in teeth, they can determine if victims were local or brought from distant regions. Such clues help untangle whether the dead were war captives, slaves, or community members chosen for sacrifice. Language experts, meanwhile, wrestle with cryptic inscriptions that might record the pleas of victims or the boasts of conquerors. Every now and then, a new discovery, a hidden tomb, a set of altars in a cave, or a trove of tablets, reshapes our understanding of how fear governed entire populations in the distant past. This continued research forces us to confront the unsettling realization that so many achievements we admire, temples, irrigation networks, roads, jewelry, statues, were partially sustained by these very practices. The masterpieces of architecture and craftsmanship were financed by tribute, forced labor, and the strategic use of terror. When standing before an ancient monument, one might feel awe at human ingenuity, yet also recall that a hierarchy, buttressed by blood rites and harsh punishments, made it possible. The same holds for lavish royal burials, which might contain gold masks, precious stones, and meticulously mummified bodies surrounded by sacrificial victims. These tombs, celebrated in modern times for their artistic and historical value, reveal a darker side upon closer inspection. Each glimmer of gold may have cost a life, or even many lives. Reflecting on these societies encourages us to question what future generations will think of our current norms. Even though human sacrifice is mostly outlawed worldwide, other forms of organized violence or punishment still exist. War, capital punishment, and extrajudicial killings remain in some regions, sometimes justified by beliefs or state necessity. The difference is that legal frameworks or public sentiment often reject the idea of sacrifice as a legitimate public event. Yet the patterns of using fear to maintain order persist in many forms, revealing that the ancient template still exerts influence. Whether those in power brand their methods as justice, deterrence, or defense of the homeland, the core dynamic, inflicting lethal consequences to ensure obedience, echoes across centuries. Ultimately, these recurring themes of terror, ritual, and power highlight a human tendency to reach for drastic solutions when faced with uncertainty. This tendency is neither isolated to any one culture nor entirely absent from modern life. It serves as a warning about how easily fear can shape politics, religion, and communal identity, especially if societies believe that only blood can solve their deepest troubles. That realization can be sobering, if we imagine standing among the crowds watching a sacrifice, or if we picture ourselves as the unfortunate victim. The horror becomes immediate and personal. The statues, bones, and texts handed down through time reveal that these events were not remote myths, but real experiences that left scars on the psyches of those involved. We, who study them today, might feel both revulsion and fascination, compelled to comprehend how such practices could endure for centuries. While much of the ancient world moved on from these extremes, some by choice, others by conquest, shadows remain in folklore, legends, and hidden shrines off the beaten path. Ruins of temples, submerged altars, and abandoned fortress dungeons bear silent witness to a world where the line between worship and death was razor thin. Local guides sometimes share stories of unquiet spirits haunting old sacrificial sites, or of curses tied to disturbing the bones of ancient victims. Whether these tales hold any literal truth, they reflect cultural memories that have not entirely faded. People sense that beneath the grand narratives of kings and conquests, there lies a deeper layer of pain and dread, whispered through generations long after the last blood offering dried in the sun. This knowledge forces us to hold two contradictory images of the ancient world in our minds. On one hand, a place of innovation, beauty, and profound cultural achievements. On the other, a place where cruelty and ritual killing could break out at any moment. Rather than dismiss these truths as relics of a bygone age, we can recognize them as part of the human story, a reminder that greatness can arise alongside horror. By acknowledging both aspects, we gain a fuller understanding of how humanity has navigated its own worst fears and how entire societies can come to accept, or at least tolerate, actions that later generations condemn as unthinkable. Many ancient societies showed a tendency to blend remarkable advances with the stark reality of organized violence. While people studied the stars, built roads, and developed trade systems, they also believed that harsh punishments or offerings of blood were the only way to satisfy gods or keep their communities safe. Over centuries, these beliefs rooted themselves in daily life. They affected how rulers judged criminals, how armies dealt with captives, and how religious leaders carried out ceremonies. The result was a network of traditions that connected religious faith, state power, and fear of the unknown. This intricate system became so accepted that few dared to question it openly, despite the pain it caused to countless individuals trapped in its path. Archaeological sites show that fear-based methods could spread and evolve through migration and conquest. For instance, when the Indo-European peoples moved across large swaths of Eurasia, they carried not only their language roots but also some of their religious or social customs. Researchers sifting through burial mounds in regions as far-flung as Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Northern India have found indicators of ritual violence or servant sacrifice in tombs. Over time, these communities adapted or merged with local groups, forming new cultures with mixed beliefs. Yet the belief that supernatural forces demanded blood persisted, whether in the form of burying servants with elites, punishing entire families for one member's misdeeds, or holding public events that reinforced the power of an unseen realm. Archaeological data confirm that this model of social control endured, even as different groups rose to power and then faded from view. The spread of iron technology and improved weaponry in many regions transformed warfare, making it easier to capture prisoners in large numbers. As a result, captives could be funneled into labor or used in sacrifice rituals, further tightening the grip of terror. Ancient texts from various places describe how soldiers marching home after victorious campaigns presented lines of prisoners, who were then judged by kings or generals. Some were spared to work fields, build monuments, or be sold in markets, while others were selected for grim ceremonies. The systematic nature of these processes shows that leadership understood the persuasive impact of terror. They used it to send a message to both their enemies and their own people: defy us, and you risk a fate worse than death, possibly ending up as a spectacle on an altar or in an arena. This atmosphere shaped the social hierarchy, reinforcing the idea that power flowed from fear of punishment as much as from loyalty or love for a ruler. In the Greek historian Polybius's accounts, there are references to the fierce discipline within some Hellenistic armies, inherited from earlier Macedonian practices. Officers who found cowardice in their ranks sometimes punished entire units, forcing soldiers to draw lots to determine who would die as an example. While this was not a formal sacrifice to gods, it followed the same logic of communal intimidation. The cost of stepping out of line could be catastrophic, leaving each individual constantly aware that small errors might lead to a very public and painful end. This parallel to Roman decimation underscores how discipline and fear walked hand in hand in many martial traditions. Commanders felt no need for mercy when they believed fear was the glue that held their forces together. Outside the Mediterranean, the Kingdom of Mauritania in North Africa and the Garamantes civilization in the Sahara also had their own codes. The Garamantes, living around fortified oases, mastered underground irrigation and participated in regional trade. They are less documented than Rome or Carthage, but surviving references suggest they handled enemies harshly. Cave paintings and some skeletal remains hint that captives might have been ritually killed to bless water sources or maintain the fertility of oasis lands. The idea that blood offerings secured water in an arid climate fits a global pattern of connecting violence to survival. Water scarcity intensified the drive to please deities or spirits that controlled rain or springs. For travelers who stumbled into Garamantes territory, tales of such practices likely spread far, adding another region to the map of places dreaded by outsiders. In prehistoric Japan, the Jomon and Yayoi cultures evolved with limited outside influence for a long period. Jomon sites occasionally feature unusual burials, including dismembered remains and what might be signs of ritual cannibalism, although interpretations differ among experts. With the Yayoi period came rice cultivation and more structured social classes. Excavations of some Yayoi villages exposed mass graves with evidence of violent deaths, arrow wounds, and blunt force trauma, alongside communal storage pits. Whether these events were linked to war or to ritual remains open to debate. But the repeated appearance of such findings reinforces the conclusion that early agrarian societies were no strangers to lethal customs. Although direct mentions of human sacrifice in ancient Japanese records are sparse, legends about blood-stained shrines or ghostly warriors persist in local folklore, implying a cultural memory of terror that later Shinto practices only partially displaced. Central and Southern Africa, before the rise of major kingdoms, featured numerous societies that left behind mostly oral histories. European and Arab travelers who arrived centuries later described how certain groups performed medicine killings to empower chiefs or to protect homesteads against perceived evils. The accounts are prone to bias, but modern fieldwork in some areas corroborates that selective human sacrifice or ritual killing was part of old traditions. A person, often accused of witchcraft or blamed for a crisis, might be chosen for a community's cleansing. While these events did not always involve high altars or monumental architecture, they still served the same function. Local leaders used violence, cloaked in spiritual terms, to maintain order. People who lived under these customs grew up in an environment where any misfortune, crop failure, disease outbreak, could trigger a hunt for someone to blame, culminating in a swift and brutal end for the accused. Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, the city kingdoms of ancient Phoenicia, beyond the well-known case of Carthage, had local variations on sacrifice. Records are scant, but some historians piece together references from Greek and Roman sources that imply the practice of child offerings. The god Baal, worshipped in different forms from Tyre to Byblos, might have received these sacrifices during times of dire need. Archaeological digs in Lebanon sometimes uncover infant bones in urns near temple sites, hinting at continuity with the Carthaginian rites. Whether these events happen on the same scale as reported in Carthage remains uncertain. Nonetheless, the recurrence of child-centered sacrifice across multiple Phoenician colonies suggests an entrenched spiritual system, one that viewed the life of a child as a currency for divine favor. The fear that local rulers and priests wielded likely kept families from resisting, no matter how terrible the cost. In Anatolia's interior, the Phrygians revered a goddess sometimes linked to Cybele, known for wild rituals and ecstatic worship. Ancient authors mention self-mutilation among her priests, and some sources hint at more extreme offerings during large festivals. While human sacrifice is not confirmed in surviving texts about the Phrygian worship of Cybele, Greek and Roman commentators often describe their ceremonies as frenzied and bloody. If not outright sacrificing humans, these rites involved enough bloodletting, through animals or self-harm, to create an atmosphere of shock and awe. Such events were designed to stir powerful emotions in participants and onlookers alike, fostering a sense that the goddess's raw power demanded drastic displays. A public overwhelmed by the intensity of these ceremonies was less likely to challenge the authority of those who directed them. Over time, Rome adopted certain elements of the Cybele cult but tried to restrain its more extreme aspects, reflecting a broader pattern of absorbing older beliefs while downplaying the parts that clashed with Roman norms. In the Andean foothills, smaller cultural groups lived alongside more dominant powers like the Inca. Some thrived by trading goods from lowland jungles, coca leaves, exotic feathers, or medicinal herbs, with highland urban centers. Remains at certain frontier sites show human skulls arranged in patterns or placed atop stone pillars. Researchers hypothesize that these displays served as boundary markers, warning outsiders not to encroach on local territory. Skulls or entire skeletons might be posted at the edges of a village, transforming them into messages of deterrence. Even if the actual rituals behind these displays were minimal, the visual impact alone reinforced the notion that trespassing risked swift and lethal consequences. This practice resonates with accounts from numerous places where body parts were used as trophies or warnings, merging social, military, and religious symbolism into a single chilling spectacle. In Arctic and subarctic regions, such as those inhabited by ancient Siberian or Inuit groups, environmental stress could lead to extreme decisions. Food scarcity and brutal winters placed intense pressure on communities. Ethnographic data from later periods contain stories of people abandoning the elderly or infirm in lethal conditions to ensure group survival. While not always framed as a formal sacrifice, it mirrored the underlying principle: one life might be surrendered to save many. In some accounts, shamans were said to arrange spirit journeys for those deemed burdens, guiding them toward death as an act of cosmic balance. Evidence from excavations in permafrost areas is rare and difficult to interpret, but occasional findings of isolated remains, combined with these oral narratives, suggest that fear of hunger and cold-shaped customs no less severe than those in warmer lands. The communal logic justified such harsh actions, though it undoubtedly left emotional scars. Certain migrations also carried frightening customs to new territories. The Polynesian expansions across the Pacific, for example, introduced ritual stratification to islands that had never before seen large-scale hierarchical societies. Oral histories from places like Easter Island, Rapa Nui, and the Marquesas mention conflicts and possible acts of cannibalism when resources ran scarce. Some speak of priests selecting victims to appease sea gods in hopes of ensuring navigational success or bountiful fishing. In Hawaii, high chiefs, ali'i, demanded strict obedience, and breaking sacred laws, kapu, could mean immediate death. Offenses included standing in the chief's shadow or touching certain forbidden objects. Though not always a formal sacrifice, the sentence functioned with the same principle: a lethal outcome demonstrated the chief's divine authority. Over time, these practices shaped local power structures, leaving behind monumental stone platforms where offerings were made, and a body of legends that echoed centuries of fear-based governance. A different approach to ritual killing emerged in some early cultures that practiced blame removal ceremonies. The idea was that misfortunes, disease, failed crops, or social chaos stemmed from sin or impurity afflicting the entire community. The group would select a scapegoat, often a person of low status or a captured foreigner, and symbolically load them with the community's guilt before driving them away or killing them. This custom appears in records from the ancient Near East, some Greco-Roman practices, and possibly in certain African traditions. While direct archaeological evidence can be hard to link to scapegoating, texts describing these events are explicit. By eliminating or casting out the scapegoat, people believe they remove the polluting force. The intense relief that often followed these rites suggests that participants felt genuine conviction that a single life could purge widespread fears. The scapegoat concept overlaps with other human sacrifice models. In every instance, the act is less about personal conflict and more about communal crisis management. Over the centuries, newly formed states or religious movements tried to stamp out these rites. Zoroastrian teachings in Persia, for instance, placed an emphasis on the moral battle between good and evil, discouraging gratuitous bloodshed. Early Christian and Islamic leaders condemned human sacrifice outright, labeling it a barbaric vestige of idolatry. Buddhist and Jain values in South Asia likewise promoted nonviolence. Yet even within these faiths, interpretations varied, and violent punishments persisted under the label of just retribution for criminals or heretics. The line between a sanctioned judicial killing and a sacrificial rite remained fuzzy. A condemned prisoner might be executed in a ceremonial context, with prayers recited to purify the community. This overlap shows that old mental frameworks about blood and divine appeasement did not vanish with the arrival of new doctrines, but instead adapted to the language and structures of the changing world. When empires like the Mongols burst onto the scene, they brought rapid conquests to vast territories. Reports of Mongol tactics emphasize their deliberate cultivation of fear, including mass killings and the display of severed heads in pyramids outside captured cities. While not typically classed as ritual sacrifices to gods, these acts served a similar function. By orchestrating large-scale terror, the Mongols reduced resistance, compelling many cities to surrender without a fight. People facing Mongol armies often believed that any sign of defiance would result in total annihilation. In a sense, this method harnessed the same logic seen in older sacrificial systems. A terrifying example in one place would discourage further challenges. Some records mention Mongol shamans' blessing campaigns, which suggests that religious backing and intimidation merged. Victims were not sacrificed on altars, yet they died in a manner that perpetuated the belief that unstoppable forces demanded total submission. Eventually, the rise of early modern states, with more formalized laws and standing armies, began to overshadow the older, more localized customs of sacrifice. Public executions still occurred, but they were often framed in legal terms rather than direct offerings to gods. Nonetheless, large ceremonies sometimes included prayers or blessings, indicating that the spiritual element had not completely disappeared. The shift toward more rational governance did not erase the ingrained habit of using fear to control populations. It simply reframed it within new political ideologies. The memory of sacrifices, headhunting, and scapegoating lingered in folk traditions and stories told around village fires. Future generations looked upon those tales with a mixture of horror and fascination, much like readers do today when encountering accounts of public altars or funeral pyres lit with living attendants. Modern anthropology sheds light on parallels between ancient societies and more recent or contemporary groups that still engage in occasional rituals of lethal violence. These ethnographic presents help researchers hypothesize how older civilizations might have justified their customs. In some remote areas, elders speak of times when a community was cursed by a series of misfortunes until a sacrifice was made, after which the crisis lifted. Anthropologists note that in these belief systems, the act itself carries a deep emotional charge that unites the community in a shared sense of relief. People might mourn the victim, but they also feel bound together by the idea that a single death was necessary to preserve the greater whole. This unity is maintained by strong taboos against speaking out, ensuring the tradition remains intact. Though fewer societies practice such rites openly today, the comparison helps piece together how ancient cultures might have viewed similar acts as normal or even beneficial. As scholars examine more recent events, they find echoes of ancient logic. Totalitarian regimes of the 20th century employed mass purges, forced labor camps, and public executions to eliminate undesirable elements. While these actions lack the formal invocation of gods, the idea that eliminating a particular group or individual would cleanse society is reminiscent of scapegoat traditions. The political and religious contexts differ, yet the underlying assumption is the same: violence is the solution to communal fear. Leaders who adopt such policies tap into primal instincts that have existed for millennia. They redirect blame for complex problems, like economic turmoil or social unrest, onto select targets. The rest of society, driven by fear, often complies, just as ancient populations watched silent and uneasy when the priests led victims up the temple steps. This repeated pattern highlights the fact that human sacrifice and ritual violence, while cloaked in old mythologies, are part of a larger dynamic of control. The ancients framed it in terms of pleasing gods or protecting cosmic balance. Modern parallels place it in the realm of political dogma or racial ideology. In both cases, the ends justify the means, and individuals pay with their lives. The challenge for historians and archaeologists is to distinguish between direct religious sacrifices and other forms of terror-based enforcement. For a victim about to die, the difference might not matter. Yet for understanding a culture, it does. It clarifies whether a society believed it was acting under divine command or merely using fear to keep power. The evidence from ancient digs, combined with textual sources, continues to refine these distinctions, revealing that often both motives merged into a single act of cruelty. Some sites, like the abandoned fortress of Hatra in modern-day Iraq, show signs of late pagan worship intermingling with emerging religions, possibly creating transitional forms of sacrifice or extreme punishment. Hatra's high walls once defended it against multiple invasions, but inside, temples boasted statues to various deities. Archaeologists have unearthed remains that might point to offerings carried out in secret even as new beliefs arrived. The slow collapse of older cults did not instantly erase the readiness to spill blood for spiritual reasons. Instead, worshippers adapted, sometimes mixing older gods with new ones, or reinterpreting ritual killings as part of a struggle against heresy. Similar transitional zones exist in parts of northwestern Europe where Christianity gradually replaced Celtic and Germanic rites, or in Africa where Islam or Christianity supplanted local animist practices. In each case, old and new beliefs coexisted for a time, producing a phase when the line between accepted and forbidden customs blurred. Meanwhile, certain ancient societies devised administrative systems that cataloged potential victims long in advance. The Aztecs, for example, had records of tribute from subject regions, which included captives designated for sacrifice. Some classical Greek city-states also kept lists of criminals or debtors who could be chosen for scapegoat rituals. In the Roman sphere, conquered territories provided slaves who might be sent into the arena. These organized approaches show a level of bureaucratic planning beneath the emotional and religious veneer. Officials made sure they had a steady pipeline of offerings or punishment candidates, reflecting how institutionalized these customs were. A priest might declare a need to appease the gods, and an official would deliver the appropriate victims in an orderly manner. This reduces the image of spontaneous, chaotic bloodshed and replaces it with a chilling sense of routine. People were processed through a system that ended in a public or private death, all to keep the machinery of power well-oiled. Learning about these structures can change how we see famous relics. For instance, the Aztec Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan was not just a grand architectural feat, it was the physical stage for countless sacrifices, integrated into the very identity of the empire. Similarly, the Roman Colosseum, while an architectural marvel, was built to host spectacles of death that satisfied the public's thirst for entertainment and served as a political tool. Observing these landmarks today, tourists may marvel at the design and scale, while few might imagine the smell of blood or the anguished cries that once filled those spaces. Yet archaeology and historical records bring these realities back to life, forcing a re-examination of ancient triumphs that might have been supported by brutal acts. In some corners of the world, local legends claim that entire communities vanished overnight, leaving behind ghost towns or empty fortifications. Archaeologists sometimes find abrupt layers of destruction, with signs of burned structures and scattered remains. While warfare is often the cause, certain myths blame mysterious mass sacrifices or supernatural retribution. People in later centuries might explain the ruins by saying the inhabitants angered the gods or refused to continue sacred rites, leading to a curse that wiped them out. Although such legends are difficult to verify, they demonstrate how deeply fear of the divine or unknown shaped regional storytelling. Even if the real cause was famine, an epidemic, or invasion, the cultural lens still points to wrathful gods or punishment for broken ritual obligations. This link between violence and ruin fed an ongoing cycle of dread, as each generation saw physical proof in the empty walls and silent streets. Through the study of old skeletons, damaged altars, and cryptic texts, modern science tries to piece together a more balanced view. Researchers measure isotopes to see if the victims were local or foreign, check bone wear to gauge their lifestyle, and even analyze pollen to understand environmental stresses that might have led to desperate actions. In some cases, they discover that a site once interpreted as a sacrificial ground was actually used for other purposes. In others, they confirm that the scale of killing was even greater than legends claimed. Each discovery refines our grasp of how these customs shape the story of human civilization. It also challenges simplistic notions that ancient societies were only about invention and progress. They were also about coping with fear, sometimes in harsh and extreme ways. Over time, moral philosophies and organized religions often labeled these acts as atrocities. Yet memory of them persisted in cautionary tales, shaping moral lessons about the dangers of blind faith or unchecked power. Even as new doctrines forbade human sacrifice, the underlying readiness to accept lethal force did not vanish. This tension is visible in many historical accounts where religious leaders condemned sacrifice in one breath while endorsing holy wars or inquisitions in another. The core premise, that violence could serve a higher cause, remained, though the specifics changed. We see that pattern repeated in different guises, from ancient altars to modern battlefields. Humanity's challenge has always been to recognize when fear is driving these actions and to decide if it aligns with any genuine moral framework or simply sustains a cycle of terror. All these facts build a grim but enlightening picture of how the quest for security, divine blessing, or community cohesion sometimes led people to commit acts of extraordinary cruelty. Ancient societies, for all their ingenuity, were not utopias. They grappled with threats, famine, disease, invasion, and mysterious natural events, and often concluded that bloodshed was a necessary response. Today, we can study these remains and writings as a cautionary lesson. They reveal the risks of letting fear rule social structures without restraint. They also warn that once violent customs become established, they can entrench themselves for generations, justified by religion, tradition, or statecraft. The old altars and arenas stand silent now, but they speak to a truth we ignore at our peril. Terror can take root anywhere if people believe it is the price for safety or cosmic favor. Some of the most harrowing aspects of ancient societies emerged when survival hung in the balance. Food shortages, resource competition, and unpredictable natural disasters made communities search for answers through extreme measures. The more dire the crisis, the more likely it was that leaders or priests demanded serious offerings, hoping to appease forces they could not control. People at every level of society lived beneath the weight of these grim possibilities. One drought might push an entire community to pick a human victim. A failed harvest might bring calls for punishing suspected witches or capturing outsiders as scapegoats. Although we now see these actions as cruel, many of those involved believed there was no other way. Ample evidence shows that entire regions relied on intimidation to maintain unity. In certain areas of prehistoric Europe, large stockades and fortifications contained designated enclosures for ritual gatherings. Excavations reveal remains of feasting, animal bones, pottery shards, and occasional human skull fragments. Specialists wonder whether these gatherings included forced sacrifices, perhaps carried out during seasonal festivals. Wooden posts, sometimes sharpened at the tip, appear near ditches holding skeletal remains. They might have served as grave markers or warnings. The line between warfare, punishment, and ritual blur. Wooden idols found in bogs present human-like features, some bearing signs of deliberate damage, such as cuts where the heart or abdomen would be. Their significance is debated. Were they placeholders symbolizing real victims, or memorials left after an actual sacrifice? The items appear near lumps of resin or pitch, possibly used as part of a burning ritual. Each new find adds layers of complexity to our understanding of how fear, spirituality, and violence merged in these enclaves. In the Near East, the transition from nomadic to settled life often brought stricter social structures. People learned to farm, domesticate animals, and shape metals, but they also developed robust hierarchies. Rulers claimed divine authority and backed it with threat of force. Alongside the great leaps in technology, old patterns of scapegoating continued. If a communal project like a canal or a temple wall collapsed, leaders might declare that someone had offended the gods. This person could be seized from the lower ranks and put to death in a ceremony meant to cleanse the building site. Officials used the occasion to reinforce the idea that any breakdown, be it a cracked foundation or a failed harvest, stemmed from spiritual imbalance. The tragedy was that those chosen for sacrifice likely had nothing to do with the actual problem. They became tools in a system that viewed violence as a direct line to cosmic power. Even if the event had no real effect on the canal's structural integrity, the psychological impact strengthened the ruler's hold. Observers concluded that life itself hinged on showing loyalty to gods and kings. Texts from ancient China's spring and autumn period mention repeated conflicts between small states. Each conflict risked famine and displacement for civilian populations. Archaeological surveys of sites destroyed in these wars revealed burnt layers, collapsed walls, and piles of bones, some of which show cut marks consistent with ritual displays after the battle. Investigations of certain city gates find skulls arranged in neat rows, possibly to warn travelers. Royal decrees from the later Han period discuss the prohibition of random executions without imperial approval, suggesting local lords had taken such matters into their own hands. This measure implies that leaders used fear at every social tier, from the emperor's grand proclamations to local fortress laws. Even though official edicts might discourage certain practices, there was often a gap between central authority and frontier realities. Generals, warlords, or magistrates might still carry out lethal traditions if they believed them crucial to local stability. In isolated regions, rites calling for the blood of outsiders or criminals could persist unnoticed by the imperial court for years. Similar conditions appeared in the ancient Americas beyond the well-known examples of Mesoamerican or Andean cultures. Researchers studying coastal settlements in what is now Chile have uncovered mass graves dating back centuries. Many of the bones show evidence of blunt trauma or decapitation, sometimes in patterned arrangements that hint at ritual. Coastal fishermen who relied on the sea for subsistence may have attributed unpredictable ocean currents or fish migration to displeased gods. Therefore, they could have resorted to human sacrifice during periods of scarcity. Such actions did not necessarily reflect the everyday ethos of these groups. Most of the time, they likely cooperated to ensure survival. But when crises hit, old beliefs about blood debt or divine wrath resurfaced with force, leading to sudden tragedies that left behind skeletal testimonies. Among the peoples of the Amazon, the challenge of thick rainforest and dangerous wildlife shaped social organization. Accounts from colonial-era writings describe how certain tribes engaged in ritual killing of captives. They might keep a prisoner alive for a period, requiring them to partake in daily village life, only to later kill them in a communal rite. Anthropologists suggest this custom served multiple purposes. It allowed the captors to absorb the spiritual essence of their enemies, prevented retaliation by eliminating rival warriors, and reinforced social bonds through a group experience of triumph. Though these sources date to post-contact periods, many believe the practice has deeper pre-contact roots, given the complexity of Amazonian cultural traditions. Excavations of certain jungle sites, though hindered by dense vegetation and soil conditions, occasionally yield evidence of trophy heads or shaped bone ornaments taken from victims. This pattern intersects with the global theme, fear and ritual violence often combined, not as random cruelty, but as a structured event that served to unify or strengthen a community's resolve. Shifting our focus to the ancient tribes across southern Siberia and Mongolia, we see that early horse-riding cultures sometimes arranged elaborate barrow burials. Inside these mounds, archaeologists discover the remains of not only a central figure, often a chieftain or noble, but also multiple human individuals inside chambers. The bodies show signs of forced death at around the same time as their master. The preserved equipment, bows, saddles, and sometimes metal weaponry, suggests these were skilled warrior societies reliant on swift cavalry raids. Their environment, marked by harsh winters and wide, windswept plains, demanded unwavering unity. Leaders expected absolute loyalty and perhaps used terrifying funerary rites to demonstrate that power did not end at death. If a leader fell, those closest might follow him by force. This belief that a leader's authority spanned life and the afterlife buttressed an already strict hierarchy built on warfare. People who objected risked social disgrace or lethal punishment, leaving little room for dissent. These barrow complexes often contained horses as well, clearly sacrificed to serve their master in the afterlife, reinforcing the notion that living beings were commodities to be used in both mortal and spiritual realms. Turning to the islands of the Mediterranean, we find smaller cultures overshadowed by major powers like Carthage, Greece, and Rome. Some island groups, particularly in the Aegean or near Sardinia, developed unique rites. Remains from certain small coastal sites show that, in times of naval threat, a community might offer captured pirates or traders to local sea gods. The practice served as a grim protective measure, sending a signal that foreign intrusion would be met with bloodshed. Pottery fragments feature depictions of bound prisoners near fish or wave motifs, seemingly celebrating these sacrifices. Meanwhile, stone altars found close to the shore contain channels that might have drained blood into the sea. We can only speculate how these ceremonies played out in detail, but each piece of evidence points to a society that placed survival above all else. If sacrificing outsiders reduced piracy or brought calmer waters, it was deemed a worthy price. Fear of attack, or of losing fishing grounds, drove them to adopt a system in which the foreigner's life balanced the scales of uncertain maritime fortune. Navigating the complexities of these customs requires separating myth from evidence. Many ancient writers had reasons to exaggerate the brutality of their foes. Greek and Roman chroniclers, for instance, sometimes depicted barbarian peoples in the most shocking terms to justify conquest. Yet archaeology has proven that some of these accounts were grounded in real rituals. The question becomes how often these events occurred. Did they happen daily, or were they reserved for extraordinary moments? In many cases, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. A single sacrifice every few years could still cast a long shadow. The mere possibility that a high priest might call for one, or that a king might punish traitors in a sacrificial manner, kept everyone cautious. Fear relies on potential as much as on frequent action. If people believe they might be the next victim, they quickly conform. Ancient legal codes sometimes spelled out gruesome punishments in explicit terms. The Middle Assyrian laws, for example, described the penalty for a woman who caused a miscarriage without permission. She could be impaled, or parts of her body could be mutilated, depending on the social status of the offended party. While not always framed as sacrifice, this type of punishment held ritual elements because it was often conducted in a communal space, with an air of religious sanction. Observers might pray or chant to show that the gods demanded such suffering. The same texts cover scenarios where men who challenged the king faced crucifixion, decapitation, or forced labor until death. By inscribing these penalties into stone or clay, the state made fear a public affair. Anyone could read, or hear read aloud, the horrifying consequences of transgression. In this way, the legal code functioned like a series of curses, ensuring that cosmic justice and earthly authority walked side by side. Connections between music, dance, and killing also appear in several ancient narratives. In certain Polynesian islands, drumming and chanting set the rhythm for sacrifices, turning them into performances that involve the entire village. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, secret societies used masked dances to intimidate spectators before executing a chosen victim. Greek tragedies might have roots in older ritual dramas where an actor's symbolic death mirrored real ceremonies once performed for Dionysus or other deities. Across these varied cultures, the blend of art and violence formed a spectacle that seared itself into participants' memories. A well-orchestrated event, merging the emotional power of music with the raw shock of bloodshed, could become a recurring tale that reinforced social norms. Those who witnessed it firsthand or heard about it from elders would think twice before questioning leadership, since they had seen or imagined the ultimate consequence. Human remains found in desert cemeteries across Arabia and North Africa sometimes bear marks suggesting that the corpse was exposed to elements or animals after death. In certain contexts, these sky burials or excarnation practices were purely funerary, with no violent aspect. But in other cases, rope marks around bones or evidence of forced restraints suggest the victims were staked out, left to die, and then devoured by scavengers. Historical references speak of tribes punishing criminals or invading enemies by abandoning them in open desert, trusting heat and hunger to complete the sentence. Over generations, such punishments acquired a quasi-religious aura, as though the gods themselves would judge the victim's worthiness. If vultures avoided a body, some believed it indicated innocence. If the remains were quickly consumed, it confirmed guilt in their view. This sinister logic once again merges fear and cosmic interpretation, casting the environment as an extension of divine will. As large empires expanded, they often absorbed small societies that practiced these forms of terror. The conquering force might initially outlaw brutal traditions to solidify control, yet ironically, conquerors themselves could adopt or adapt elements of these customs when convenient. Roman governors stationed in distant provinces, for example, sometimes allowed local festivals involving animal sacrifice or even human-like effigies, hoping to keep the peace. Meanwhile, rebellious villages faced Roman crucifixions or mass killings that mirrored the local brand of terror but on a larger scale. This cycle of influence and counter-influence shaped frontiers across continents. In some frontier zones, officials married local leaders' daughters, blending traditions. Children born of these unions inherited a mix of beliefs. Over time, entire populations evolved ritual violence that combined old and new elements. The result was a patchwork in which fear, control, and religious homage crossed cultural lines. Certain objects found in ancient burial sites, amulets, carved figures, or personal tokens, provide a glimpse into how individuals might have tried to protect themselves from falling victim to these harsh customs. For instance, a soldier might wear a pendant blessed by a priest who promised it would shield him from misfortune. A mother might bury protective charms under her doorstep, hoping that no official or priest would target her children for sacrifice. These quiet acts of self-preservation, largely invisible in official records, remind us that people in every era have sought ways to resist or minimize the power that fear held over them. Occasionally, graffiti carved into a hidden spot in a temple or fortress reveals frustration or dissent. A small figure with arms raised might accompany a curse against unjust priests, or a line of text might read, "May the gods punish those who spill innocent blood." These small acts of defiance often went unnoticed by the authorities, but they stand as proof that not everyone accepted terror without question. Some leaders tried to pivot away from violence. A few Egyptian rulers emphasized moral teachings, discouraging random executions. A handful of Chinese philosophers advocated benevolent governance, calling for fairness rather than brutality. In certain moments, compassion emerged within the complex religious frameworks that once demanded blood. But these reforms tended to appear during times of relative stability or strong centralized control. Whenever chaos struck, famine, invasion, plague, calls for violent appeasement often resurfaced. People clung to the old ways in desperation, convinced that only the most drastic actions could restore balance. The interplay between periods of reform and relapse helps explain why these customs were so persistent. They thrived in unstable conditions, and ancient life was frequently unstable. The seeds of fear lay dormant, ready to bloom whenever hardships returned. Propaganda tools also played a key role. Kings commissioned stone reliefs that showed them single-handedly slaying enemies or conquering cities. These images conveyed a narrative of dominance. In many depictions, a divine figure stands beside the king, placing a hand on his shoulder or offering a weapon. This visual message implies that the ruler's violence is sanctioned by the gods, elevating simple warfare or judicial killing into a cosmic drama. Meanwhile, the defeated captives in these scenes often appear small and huddled, reinforcing the idea that those who defy the ruler are both morally and physically diminished. When the public saw these reliefs carved on temple walls or palace gates, they internalized the story, resist the king, and you become just another figure cowering at his feet. Over generations, such imagery became part of the cultural script. Even if a new dynasty rose, it might adopt similar visual motifs, perpetuating the same underlying intimidation. Some groups sustained their harsh customs despite changes in leadership by cloaking them in secret cults or mystery rites. In the Hellenistic era, after Alexander the Great's campaigns, many regions around the Mediterranean and Near East mingled Greek elements with indigenous beliefs. New cults sprang up that blended deities from multiple pantheons. Among these were occasional references to hidden ceremonies that involved bloodshed. Strabo, Plutarch, and other writers hint at enclaves in the mountains of Anatolia or the Levant where devotees performed midnight offerings, far from the eyes of city dwellers. Although direct evidence is scarce, the repeated nature of these rumors suggests a kernel of truth. Local elites might claim special communion with ancient deities, requiring secret sacrifices to maintain cosmic order. Outsiders would be kept away, stoking rumors that anything, human or animal, could be offered under moonlit skies. In this way, older forms of terror adapted, slipping underground as public norms shifted. Far to the east, in parts of Southeast Asia, Indian influences brought Hinduism and later Buddhism to regions that had their own animist traditions. Local epics written on palm leaves occasionally mention kings who invited Brahmins to sanctify a new capital or a new dynasty. Some accounts describe how these Brahmins demanded an ultimate gift to ensure divine blessing. Depending on which source one consults, that gift might be ceremonial livestock or, in rare cases, a person singled out as the seed that would make the foundation strong. Perhaps in some sites, these stories remained only that legends passed among bards. But the occasional discovery of skeletons beneath city walls or near cornerstones adds a measure of weight to them. Such finds, though not conclusively linked to foundation sacrifices, spark questions that resonate with traditions worldwide. Is the city stable because of a life given at its birth? People who believed in these rites would see them as vital steps in building a community that would last centuries. On the flip side, for the chosen victim, it was the final step of a life cut tragically short. Meanwhile, in Europe, the spread of Christianity gradually chipped away at official pagan sacrifices. Priests preached that only one supreme sacrifice was needed in Christian theology, rejecting the older idea that each crisis required blood. Yet as many historians note, medieval Europe hardly abandoned violence. Public executions, trials by ordeal, in which hunts replaced or overshadowed older sacrificial customs, preserving the principle that fear and death served as binding forces in society. The overall concept survived. When trouble loomed, someone had to suffer for it. Whether burned at the stake or hanged in the town square, the victim was meant to purge the community of evil. This pattern continued well into early modern times, proving how deeply the roots of terror-based order ran. The parallels between these historical cases and later centuries are stark. The pattern repeats: a group feels threatened, leadership claims a special relationship with the divine or the cosmos, and a victim is chosen. Perhaps it is a prisoner of war, a slave, a suspected witch, or a criminal. The end goal is the same: to reinforce authority and quell fear by channeling it into a violent act. The chilling consistency of this approach underscores its effectiveness as a tool of control. Even if it eventually outrages more humane sensibilities, in the short term, it solves immediate anxieties by providing a scapegoat or a public demonstration of power. That, in essence, is why it persisted across civilizations. As long as people believed fear was necessary, the cycle found fertile ground. For modern viewers or readers, these ancient events can appear distant and alien. Yet they shaped many of the structures we still see. A city wall that has stood for millennia might hide a dark secret at its foundations. A famous inscription praising the mercy of a king might gloss over the mass graves discovered just beyond the palace. A revered temple might have drawn pilgrims who were unaware of the captives sacrificed in its early days. Peeling back these layers reveals a more complicated story of human progress, one intertwined with intimidation, loss, and grim necessity. No region is entirely exempt from this pattern, and few cultures have no record of it at all. Instead, we find it weaving through human history like a constant reminder that our capacity for creativity matches our capacity for cruelty when survival feels uncertain. Remnants of these dynamics persist in modern rites or superstitions. Some societies still consider certain boundaries or thresholds taboo, recalling old beliefs that crossing them without the right offerings can trigger doom. Certain festivals include references to hunts or mock executions that reenact vanished ceremonies. Even child tales and games sometimes echo these themes: ritual capture, symbolic sacrifice, or banishment. Over time, they become softened, turned into allegory or entertainment, but their origin can often be traced to genuine acts of terror. For instance, some playground rhymes about heads rolling or limbs falling can be interpreted as watered-down memories of old punishments. These echoes provide a subtle reminder that while the world has changed, vestiges of that fear-driven mindset remain embedded in cultural traditions. It is easy to condemn these old societies as cruel, but that risks ignoring the reasons they turn to violence. People who lived in a world where a single failed crop meant death for hundreds might have felt no choice but to rely on horrifying methods to coax favor from gods. Societies ravaged by repeated invasions would see terror as a deterrent. Communities lacking modern medicine might interpret illness as a curse requiring ritual cleansing. A victim was offered not just to appease divine forces but to restore psychological order. This does not excuse the harm done, but it places it in a context that highlights desperation. Understanding this dynamic offers insight into our own tendencies. When under extreme pressure, humans can rationalize surprising levels of brutality. From a broader perspective, these ancient terrors teach a cautionary tale about conflating moral virtue with cultural achievement. A society can excel in architecture, literature, or trade yet still practice ritual killings. The presence of advanced crafts, literacy, or complex governance does not guarantee compassion. The impetus behind cruelty often lies deeper, in collective fears and a desire to control uncertain conditions. In many ways, it is a lesson that resonates with later history. States can champion art and philosophy while enforcing harsh punishments or waging destructive wars. Looking back at these distant examples helps us see that the moral dimension of a civilization cannot be measured solely by its monuments or innovations. When archaeologists piece together these clues, bones and mass graves, altars with channels for blood, inscriptions praising rulers who crush foes, they form a portrait of societies that accepted cruelty as part of life. Observers in modern times might recoil, yet for those who lived then, it could be as ordinary as taxes or harvest festivals. The logic behind terror was woven into every major institution. Rulers believed it kept them in power, priests thought it pleased the gods, and most people felt it was inevitable. They feared that rejecting the system would bring greater calamity. Evidence of silent dissent exists, but rarely did it reach a scale large enough to rewrite the rules. The few times it did, revolutions often led to new regimes that found different excuses for lethal force, continuing the cycle. Though historians highlight the shift away from large-scale ritual violence in many parts of the world after certain religious or political reforms, the fundamental dynamic of fear-based rule reappears throughout time. Whenever institutions wobble, or when leaders crave absolute control, the old instincts surface. Groups perceived as threats might be labeled enemies, heretics, or sinners, singled out for removal or exemplary punishment. The ancient blueprint, using a public act of violent retribution to unify everyone else, remains tempting to unscrupulous regimes. Thus, the study of these older events is not purely academic. It serves as a reminder that civilizations can revert to terror when faced with looming crises. By recognizing how normal it once seemed to kill in the name of cosmic order, people today might better detect warning signs of cruelty disguised as necessity. Excavations, deciphered tablets, and forensic analysis of ancient bones continue to unearth new information. Each piece deepens the narrative of how far humans went to control the uncontrollable. Entire populations orchestrated elaborate cycles of violence because they believed it was the only path to safety or success. The cumulative effect of these discoveries is sobering. By reading the marks left on skulls, the arrangement of sacrificial altars, or the messages carved on victory steles, we confront a shared legacy that shaped countless generations. It is a part of history that lingers in the background whenever we admire a stunning temple or read about a glorious empire. These reflections reveal more than macabre curiosities, they challenge the rose-tinted view of the ancient past. People used advanced knowledge in astronomy, engineering, and writing, yet also employed systematic fear to handle adversity. When storms battered coasts, when rivers flooded, when enemies threatened trade routes, the solution often boiled down to a deadly ritual. This duality of brilliance and brutality runs through the entire human saga. Even now, though direct human sacrifice is widely rejected, echoes of those old ideas about controlling chaos through violence still resound in policies and rhetoric that blame or target specific groups for larger problems. A deep awareness of these ancient patterns can help us question assumptions about how best to respond to crises, pushing us to seek alternatives to old cycles of fear and harm. In the end, the ruins and artifacts left behind by ancient societies speak volumes if we listen. Each step into an excavated temple or burial site might reveal another layer of the fear that once guided daily life. The broken knives, the scattered bones, the incised curses, all point to a world that saw blood as a gateway to resolution. While we marvel at the artistry of carvings and the complexity of old cities, we also confront the cost in human life. Beneath the layers of stone are stories of individuals who likely had little say in the matter, sacrificed to keep the balance or to uphold a ruler's command. Their remains stand as stark proof that fear has been one of humanity's oldest and most enduring laws, shaping destinies and forging communities through acts that fill modern eyes with horror. Such knowledge underscores a fundamental question: what lessons can we draw from these ancient terrors for our own time? If fear is so potent that it can drive entire civilizations to commit atrocities in the name of higher purpose, how can societies today guard against falling into similar traps under new guises? Archaeology and history offer no easy answers, but they remind us that each era believes its choices are valid. Future generations may look back on some present-day practices with the same shock we feel about old rites. Recognizing this helps cultivate vigilance. If we do not actively examine how fear influences our decisions, we risk echoing patterns that once set altars awash in blood and haunted thousands with the threat of an awful end. Ancient campaigns of conquest often targeted regions with fewer defenses, and local populations quickly realized that surrender might be better than brutal reprisals. Some accounts describe how entire villages, hearing of an approaching army's reputation for mass slaughter, chose to open their gates rather than risk a violent end. This logic helped fear-based strategies spread across multiple continents. Whether it was Assyrian kings boasting on palace walls about flaying rebels, or Celtic chieftains piling captured heads at a fortified hilltop, the effect was the same: potential enemies hesitated to resist. Examples from classical sources mention repeated episodes where desert towns in North Africa or scattered tribes in the Iberian Peninsula refused to fight, knowing the alternative was an annihilation used as a statement. References to these tactics appear in Greek historian Diodorus Siculus's notes on the cruelty of certain generals, as well as in Chinese chronicles recounting how warlords forced submission. The formula never varied: threaten a horrifying fate, back it up with at least one real demonstration, and watch as neighboring areas scramble to negotiate rather than rebel. In that environment, the rumor mill played a big role. Even a small force could seem unstoppable if it carried stories of savage punishment. The recipients of these reports, having no easy way to verify details, often believed the worst. Over time, conquering armies had little need to exaggerate. Each new round of subjugation produced enough genuine horror to fuel further legends. Priestly classes also benefited from these dynamics. They proclaimed that gods demanded blood to protect the land from famine, disease, or enemy raids. During major religious festivals, these priests sometimes orchestrated large ceremonies in which war prisoners were brought forward and executed in public. The watchers, whether they were peasants or minor nobles, absorbed the message that divine favor hinged on mortal suffering. It offered an odd sense of reassurance. Rather than seeing war, drought, or storms as random events, they could blame a lack of sacrifices or improper rituals for each misfortune. This line of thought persisted until new belief systems, or more stable economies, reduced the perceived need for such extremes. Even so, the tradition usually did not vanish overnight. Occasionally, societies channeled terror into massive building projects. A historian examining the Great Wall of China or certain Roman frontier fortifications might discover references to forced labor, with those who resisted facing death. Captives from border wars could be thrown into these backbreaking tasks. Roman records mention penal legions, criminals or deserters coerced into construction and military service, forced to labor until exhaustion took their lives. Chinese imperial edicts sometimes demanded thousands of workers from distant provinces for a single wall section, with local officials handing over not just able-bodied men but also offenders deemed enemies of the state. The system thrived on the knowledge that refusal equaled swift punishment, possibly extended to one's family. Over time, these structures became symbols of imperial might. Tourists today may admire them without always realizing how many perished to build them. In certain cultures, specialized executioners formed an elite class, schooled in the correct procedures for ritual killings. The Aztec Empire had officiants trained to remove hearts swiftly, ensuring the victim's final seconds aligned with ceremonial precision. Ancient scripts from India refer to official headsmen who understood that a single misstep could anger gods or local rulers. Egyptian reliefs show uniformed soldiers carrying out punishments under the watchful eye of scribes who recorded each detail. In Japan, the role of the official swordsman eventually turned into a regulated practice, seen later in the feudal era, though its roots extend back to older times. Across these regions, execution became both a craft and a performance, complete with set techniques and symbolic gestures. Locals learned to fear not just the ruler but also those who enforced the ruler's will. Another approach involved weaving terror into legal statutes that addressed issues of honor or communal well-being. If someone insulted an official or defied a religious mandate, punishments could include forced starvation, dismemberment, or being burned alive. Such fates were not simply about killing the offender, they were about turning the death into a message. A body left to rot in public, or displayed at a gate, carried a potent warning. Over many generations, populations internalized these lessons and taught them to children. Myths sprouted around these punishments, saying the condemned person's ghost wandered the area, cursing the spot where the body was left. Such folklore further discouraged people from stepping out of line. The fear was not just physical but also spiritual, linking social transgressions to everlasting torment. Archaeologists sometimes find disturbing signs of mass suicides in places facing unstoppable armies known for cruelty. Families, hearing the near footsteps of destruction, chose a quick death rather than subjugation or the risk of ritual humiliation. Accounts of the siege of Masada in Judea describe how rebels ended their own lives to avoid falling into Roman hands. In parts of ancient India, episodes called Jauhar involved women and children immolating themselves when defeat by a merciless enemy became certain. Though these are separate from formal sacrifice, they reflect the climate of panic that accompanied armies reputed for savage reprisals. Rather than be paraded as trophies or forced into public slaughter, people decided to die on their own terms. These tragic events highlight the ultimate effect of widespread terror tactics. Communities concluded that living under a cruel conqueror was worse than collective suicide. In the British Isles during pre-Roman times, tribal warfare could be relentless. Pits containing dismembered bodies, possibly the result of raids or sacrificial offerings, pop up in various archaeological surveys. Some historians infer that, after a victory, the triumphant tribe might make a show of disposing the defeated in a sacred bog or watery pit. This ensured that the enemy spirits remained trapped, unable to haunt the victors. The practice of depositing weapons or precious objects in water aligns with this worldview, symbolically burying the power of the foe. Wetlands thus held spiritual significance, and if a tribe believed a particular site demanded a blood gift, they might toss both bodies and spoils of war into its murky depths. These customs, though foreign to modern sensibilities, fit a larger pattern where water or bogs connected to the underworld, forming a direct channel for appeasing mysterious forces. Detailed accounts from the ancient city of Babylon highlight a class system that spelled out different punishments depending on social rank. A noble who plotted against the king might face a swift, though horrifying, public death. A lower-class laborer caught stealing grain might be enslaved or have a limb removed. People with special religious roles often had their own rules. If a priest was found guilty of sacrilege, older texts suggest they could be walled up alive, sealed within a chamber as an offering to the gods they were believed to have offended. The city's code integrated the idea that life could be forfeit whenever tradition or authority demanded it. Fear thus kept the economic machinery running, farmers paid tribute, craftsmen stayed in their guilds, and merchants stuck to legal channels, all to avoid the dreaded penalties for disobedience. Studies of Mycenaean tomb shafts in mainland Greece suggest that some high-ranking individuals were buried with a small retinue of attendants who died at roughly the same time. Although the evidence is not conclusive, it suggests that these retinues might have been sacrificed or chosen to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. Bone analysis reveals they were younger and likely of lower status, supporting the theory that they served as a final show of loyalty. Greek myths speak about the condemnation of burying living people with the dead, reflecting later moral shifts, yet the older archaeological layers point to a time when such acts were more commonplace. Similar attitudes appear in Proto-Celtic burials near the Danube, where a chieftain's wives or servants may have been strangled to follow him beyond. The continuity across cultures lies in the principle that a leader's existence transcended death, and that subordinates were expected to remain loyal, even at the cost of their own lives. The double-edged sword of terror also bred constant intrigue in royal courts. Ambitious courtiers who sought power might accuse rivals of sacrilege or conspiracy to trigger lethal sentences. Ancient Persian chronicles mention how satraps sometimes denounced each other to the king, hoping to eliminate competition. If the king or his advisors believed the accusations, trials could end in torture or public executions that made clear no one was safe from the system. The slightest misstep or hint of disloyalty might result in humiliating punishments. Gold plates or inscriptions praising the benevolence of rulers often clashed with these behind-the-scenes realities, where everyone watched their words and formed secret alliances. Fear ruled more effectively than open warfare. As long as subjects worried about being accused, they hesitated to challenge authority. The concept of binding oaths with blood also appears repeatedly. Some tribal confederations demanded that members swear loyalty over a sacrifice, often an animal but occasionally a prisoner of war. If one broke the oath, legends stated that the same fate would befall them. In Greek tradition, for instance, the oath swearing at the altar of Zeus had dramatic overtones of retribution from the gods. Among the Scythians, historical sources claim that leaders drank wine mixed with the blood of their allies during pacts. This served as a direct statement: betrayal would literally taint one's own bloodstream. The fear of curse-like consequences could be as powerful as a physical threat. These beliefs traveled along trade routes, with merchants, mercenaries, and migrants carrying stories of such binding rights to distant lands. Over time, the idea that betrayal invited death became woven into many legal and religious frameworks, even if the practice itself changed forms. When famine or plagues devastated a region, societies often sought a scapegoat. Ancient Mesoamerican codices show images of city-states performing large-scale offerings when entire harvests failed. The priests might accuse local sinners of angering the gods, or they might blame nearby enemy tribes. Captured foes would be singled out for a public event, with the whole city present to witness their deaths. Spanish chroniclers describe how the Aztecs, upon realizing major droughts threatened the capital, organized deeper raids into outlying territories to gather sacrifice victims. The logic insisted that only the rarest and grandest offerings could persuade the gods to bring rain. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, though official doctrine forbade human sacrifice, fear of witches and heretics played a similar role. Entire villages might burn a suspected witch if crops failed, believing that a single malicious person had blocked heaven's favor. This cyclical approach, crisis, blame, sacrifice, appears in every major region at some point, reflecting a universal attempt to make sense of hardships. Remote monasteries or hermit enclaves sometimes wrote condemnations of these violent acts. In the highlands of Ethiopia, early Christian monks composed texts criticizing local rulers who practiced older sacrificial rites or violent punishments. In the Himalayas, Buddhist lamas occasionally struggled against folk customs involving blood offerings to mountain spirits. The tension between formal doctrine and popular belief caused conflict, as religious reformers tried to curb cruelty, while many lay people clung to the notion that only bloodshed could ward off calamities. In some cases, the monks or lamas themselves were threatened with exile or death if they opposed local tradition too strongly. This reveals a crucial dimension: terror was not solely used by formal states or kings. Villages, clans, and tribal elders could also resort to it when they perceived a threat to their spiritual or social order. Archaeological findings at old trade hubs like Palmyra in Syria or Petra in Jordan indicate that merchant caravans passing through might have been taxed or even forced to contribute a victim for local rituals. Desert inscriptions near certain caravan stops show images of what look like captive individuals alongside references to gods of trade and travel. This suggests that the movement of goods became entangled with religious obligations to ensure safe passage. If the caravan leaders refused, they risked angering local gods or local authorities. Over centuries, some of these sites flourished financially, implying that caravans usually complied. In a precarious environment where bandits, storms, and scorching heat all threaten trade routes, the fear of losing an entire shipment could be enough to make a small sacrifice appear necessary, even if it meant a life ended in the middle of the desert. Stories of cannibal feasts, such as those told by Herodotus about certain nomadic tribes, or by later explorers about Pacific Islanders, sometimes mixed fact and fiction. Still, enough archaeological and ethnographic data exist to confirm that ritual cannibalism did occur in pockets around the world. The driver was not always hunger; sometimes it had a spiritual dimension, consuming an enemy's flesh to gain their strength or to terrify rivals. Though these cases are relatively rare compared to other forms of ritual violence, they underscore the lengths people could go when fear of enemies or a desire for power took hold. Bones with cut marks consistent with filleting, cooking, or chewing have been uncovered in multiple distinct regions. Each time, they reignite debates about how widespread the practice was and how it fit into the belief systems of ancient communities. Over time, references to these grim methods shifted in tone. Once certain religions declared human sacrifice a sin or introduced doctrines about compassion for enemies, local histories cast older practices in a negative light. Chronicles reinterpreted them as savage relics of a bygone era. Yet the transformation rarely happened instantly. In many areas, transitional phases lasted generations, in which official edicts banned open sacrifices, but underground or clandestine rites continued. Ancient altars might be repurposed as Christian or Buddhist shrines, but rumors circulated that the old ceremonies still took place at night. Some groups even merged the new faith with their previous customs, substituting symbolic effigies or animals for human victims, preserving the structure of the ritual while lessening its lethal element. Anthropologists see parallels in how communities respond to deep-seated fears. The meltdown of old political orders, the arrival of new conquerors, or ecological catastrophes can trigger a resurgence of violent customs. For example, historical records from Southeast Asia indicate that after major upheavals, like the collapse of powerful states, certain outlying populations returned to ancestral rites involving blood sacrifice. They believed the new instability required an older, proven form of appeasing the unseen. In these cycles, terror functioned as a coping mechanism for dramatic change. Only when a stable authority re-emerged, offering alternative methods to quell fear, Did the community scale back or hide the practice again? The challenge for modern researchers is piecing together incomplete data without imposing modern moral judgments too heavily. The factual remains, scarred bones, weapons left in altars, or texts praising the holy killings demanded by gods, speak for themselves about the historical reality. People might seek rationales behind these brutal acts, but from the perspective of a victim who lost their life on a stone platform or at the foot of a city gate, the motivation offered little comfort. Each artifact or record complicates our image of the ancient world. For every shining monument or philosophical treatise, there might be a mass grave, a blood-stained carving, or an inscription detailing agonizing punishments. Reconciling these extremes is part of understanding that history is rarely straightforward. We also see how certain leaders tried to shift the blame for these rites onto the people they conquered. The Roman Republic, for instance, criticized the Carthaginians for infant sacrifices while largely ignoring its own gladiatorial shows and crucifixions. The Aztecs insisted their neighbors engaged in equally large-scale sacrifices whenever possible. Rival Greek city-states accused one another of barbaric customs, sometimes to justify interventions. These accusations underscore how pointing to someone else's horrors can become a political or moral weapon. Yet the underlying theme is that most of these societies had some form of institutionalized violence. Whether formal sacrifice or punitive executions, each justified by tradition, ideology, or religion, the outcome was the same: deliberate killing as a statement of power and a method to control fate. One recurring thread is the use of intimidation to ward off doom. The ancients faced real threats: disease, famine, natural disasters, and often felt powerless. If a voice of authority claimed that violence could avert catastrophe, many complied. While advanced knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, or engineering emerged in some civilizations, these sciences did not always translate into moral frameworks that rejected bloodshed. Instead, the knowledge coexisted with older beliefs. A brilliant astronomer might help time a ceremony to align with celestial events, ensuring the best moment to sacrifice a prisoner. A skilled engineer might design a more efficient structure for holding or displaying victims. This synergy of progress and cruelty seems contradictory, yet it flourished repeatedly. It took centuries of evolving ethics, global trade, religious transformations, and philosophical debates before large-scale opposition to these customs gained momentum. Certain moral thinkers in late antiquity questioned whether gods would truly desire blood. A few Roman intellectuals mocked the idea that bright, celestial deities needed mortal entrails. Early Christian writers echoed these criticisms, condemning pagan blood rites as acts of demons. Some Eastern traditions taught compassion and the sacredness of all life, gradually undermining the logic behind sacrifice. Still, even these new teachings did not always end cruelty outright. Wars, persecutions, and forced conversions carried their own brand of terror. In different eras, states replaced the old religious scaffolding with secular or bureaucratic forms of intimidation. Public torture, decimation, or forced labor for criminals and prisoners of war continued. The brand changed, but the structure remained, hinged on the power of fear to uphold social order. As the centuries advanced, large empires like Byzantium, the Caliphates, the Tang dynasty, and eventually various European monarchies introduced more elaborate laws and courts. Official rhetoric might renounce barbaric practices, yet beheadings, maimings, and burnings for heresy persisted. The difference was that these punishments were framed as legal necessities rather than divine imperatives. Records from medieval Europe chronicle how convicted criminals were flogged, dismembered, or displayed on pikes in public spaces. The crowd learned that transgression led to horrifying ends. In many Islamic regions, certain crimes were punishable by stoning or amputation, deemed justified by religious law. In the Far East, slow execution methods sometimes lingered. Though the direct link to appeasing gods faded in some places, the social function of fear endured. In remote borderlands, older traditions mixed with new laws. Tribes under nominal imperial rule might still hold secret offerings. Archival letters from governors or missionaries reveal exasperation. They tried to ban savage rites, but after they left, the locals returned to old ways. Fear of curses and spirits ran deep, and no single decree could uproot beliefs set in place over generations. Even the most determined rulers found it nearly impossible to watch every village or mountain shrine. They sometimes resorted to spectacle-laden repressions, burning down suspected holy groves or executing local priests, hoping to break the cycle of fear by instilling a new one. The irony is that they fought terror with terror, repeating the pattern in a different form. This historical lineage offers a stark contrast to modern ideals about human rights. Yet it underscores how deeply ingrained fear was as a political and spiritual tool. Reading about these events, many people today feel uneasy, recognizing that under certain pressures, societies can revert to old patterns. The scapegoat principle, the demonization of others, and the belief that sacrificial violence might solve social turmoil appear time and again. Knowledge of these historical facts warns that humans are capable of rationalizing nearly any act if they feel threatened or if authority figures frame it as necessary. Even as we celebrate ancient achievements, like the beauty of Greek sculpture or the precision of Chinese engineering, we confront the dark side that coexisted with such triumphs. In sum, the evidence from archaeology, written records, and oral tradition paints a wide-ranging but consistent picture. Through rituals of blood, societies attempted to direct fear, ensuring that cosmic or social order remained intact. The next generation inherited these customs and passed them on. Some tried to reform them, others clung to them even more fiercely. Scenes of violence became embedded in cultural memory, retold in epics, ballads, and local lore. Art forms that flourished, whether intricately carved reliefs or mesmerizing chants, often carried hints of these gruesome acts. Listeners and spectators, even if they had not personally witnessed a sacrifice, understood its place in the grand scheme of things. That awareness kept social structures in place, forging a bond between terror and survival that would last until deeper shifts in worldview chipped away at its foundations. No region was exempt, and no era fully escaped the influence of fear-based rule. The blueprint repeated itself in different guises: a warlord who displayed severed heads, a temple complex strewn with bones, a set of laws prescribing mutilation for theft, or a cryptic rite performed in a forest clearing. Each scenario drew on the same underlying assumption that pain and death, displayed publicly, could shield a community from chaos. Even those who recognized the cruelty felt compelled to comply, hoping that at least their own family would be spared. Centuries passed before enough voices questioned the cycle outright, and even then, the record shows that old habits died slowly, sometimes morphing into state-sponsored violence under new labels. We continue to learn about this legacy through fresh archaeological digs, newly translated documents, and advanced dating techniques that clarify timelines. Each breakthrough offers more examples of how ancient civilizations managed fear. Some might argue these lessons highlight how far humankind has come, while others see them as reminders of how easily societies can regress if challenges overwhelm reasoned discourse. The tension between progress and regression defines a large part of history. Ruins once filled with screams may now lie silent under farmland or modern cities, but their stories remain in the ground, in uncovered artifacts, and in the echoes of cultural memory. By paying attention, people can better understand the forces that shaped humanity's path, with all its awe-inspiring heights and unsettling depths.